Secretaries of the Tobago House of Assembly, Permanent Secretaries, Chairmen and Executive Management of State Enterprises and Statutory Authorities, distinguished guests, members of the media. Good morning and welcome to the Spotlight on the Economy 2022. It is indeed a distinct honor to be your master of ceremonies this morning. I am Brian Manning, Minister in the Ministry of Finance. The Spotlight on the Economy is the vanguard event of the Ministry of Finance. It is an offshoot of the Spotlight on Energy and the Economy held in 2017 by the Office of the Prime Minister. The event allows the Ministry and its stakeholders to review fiscal policies from prior budgets and gauge their impact, as well as highlight areas for improvement. As such, previous Spotlight events have featured presenters from sectors such as manufacturing, trade, retail, energy, alongside the policymakers within the Ministry of Finance. The Spotlight on the Economy 2022 event is intended to bring together citizens from various leadership sectors of our society, both in the public and in the private sectors, and industry professionals to focus in earnest on the current economic position of Trinidad and Tobago and discuss proposals for the future development of our country. The panel, which consists of Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Colm Imbert, Minister of Finance, economist Dr. Dave Siraton, Lecturer in International Money and Finance, excuse me, at the Institute of International Relations, University of the West Indies, Dr. Dorian Noel, Deputy Governor, Monetary Operations and Policy, Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and Ms. Suzette Leachy, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance, will comprehensively explain our current financial situation, fiscal policies over the last 7 years, and financial and economic plans and strategies going forward. Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley will deliver the opening address. Dr. Dave Siraton will use his background in international economics to contextualize a range of global phenomena, including energy, disease, warfare, and politics, and their impact on regional and local economies. Dr. Dorian Noel, in his capacity as Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, will discuss the importance of buffers in the resilience of our economy. Permanent Secretary Mrs. Leachy will be doing a review of fiscal operations for the period 2017 to 2022. The Honorable Minister of Finance will be reviewing his fiscal policies of the last 7 years and discussing the way forward in the current global economic climate. The panel discussion that follows these presentations will field questions from the in-person audience as well as the virtual audience. Virtual viewers are asked to pose their questions on the Ministry of Finance's live feed of the Spotlight on the Economy event. Questions will be sent onto the host of the event, yours truly, via display monitor. Then I will pose these questions to the panel for their feedback. To place the presentations and discussions into context, I would like to provide you with a brief overview of the economy. 2015 to present, the challenges faced by this administration when it was voted into office in 2015 are all well known. During 2016 to 2019, the country experienced declining oil and gas production due to its aging infrastructure and depleting output from mature fields. Persistent challenges within the energy sector, real GDP growth in Trinidad and Tobago recorded an average contraction of 3.5% over the period 2016 to 2020. Like the rest of the world, we were then confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The implementation of public health measures worldwide severely impacted the Trinidad and Tobago economy, resulting in a decline in economic activity by 7.4% in 2020. During this period, the government provided fiscal support to help the most vulnerable groups and to enable business continuity and access to capital through a number of programs, like the Special Import Forex Window for established importers of essential items, the Loan Guarantee Program offered to small and medium enterprises, and the Entrepreneurial Relief Grant Facility administered by the National Entrepreneurship Development Company. During its stewardship, the government has sought to reduce the fiscal deficit. There has generally been a declining trend in government's expenditure due to the prioritization of expenditure and employment of expenditure switching measures. This was, however, disrupted in 2020 with the implementation of the COVID-19 fiscal measures. However, expenditure is anticipated to decline to 29.7% by the end of fiscal 2022. Further, while general government debt increased by 18.9% from fiscal 2015 to July 2022, it should be noted that up to fiscal 2019, debt financing was utilized mainly for deficit financing, development projects, and operational support for state-owned enterprises and statutory authorities. During the period fiscal 2020 and fiscal 2022, however, debt financing was also utilized for pharmaceuticals, COVID-19 vaccines, and social support programs. Investor confidence in the Trinidad and Tobago economy has been buoyant as a direct result of prudent and effective management of the country's debt portfolio, as well as the enactment of sound macroeconomic policies by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. In 2021, we began to see signs of an economic recovery in our country. The measures and initiatives employed, as well as the fiscal discipline practiced by this government since it assumed office, are bearing fruit. Total revenue is estimated to increase to 27.7% of GDP in fiscal 2022 due to increased revenues from the energy and non-energy sectors. Trinidad and Tobago is now on a path to stronger growth coming out of the pandemic. And now for our main speaker. Let's take a pause for a moment for the national anthem of Trinidad and Tobago. And now for our featured, please have a seat. Thank you. Now for our featured speaker, a man who needs no introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. The Prime Minister, the Honorable Keith Rowley, was born on October 24th, 1949 in Mason Hall, Tobago, and was raised by his grandparents, who were prominent Tobago farmers. He is a volcanologist who obtained his doctorate in geology, specializing in geochemistry. He first ran for political office in 1981, where he contested the Tobago West seat. To date, Dr. Rowley has the distinction of being the only People's National Movement candidate to have contested a seat in a general election in both Tobago and Trinidad. Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley is a member of the House of Representatives for Diego Martin West in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, where he has represented the constituency since 1991, having been re-elected in 1995, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2007, and 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley.
Thank you very much, Minister Manning. A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen, all present here at the Hyatt and those who are following us on the various platforms. Permit me to acknowledge the presence of members of the Cabinet, my Cabinet colleagues and other members of the Parliament, members of the private sector who
The winning numbers in the National Lottery online draws for Thursday, 1st September 2022. At 10:30 a.m., play rate number 34, Blind Man, Mega Ball called. Pick 2, the numbers 16 and 4 in that order. Pick 4, the numbers 1, 4, 7 and 3 in that order. At 1 p.m., play rate number 30, House Cat. Pick 2, the numbers 16 and 12 in that order. Pick 4, the numbers 8, 1, 1 and 2 in that order. At 4 p.m., play rate number 30, House Cat, Mega Extreme Ball called. Pick 2, the numbers 4 and 31 in that order. Pick 4, the numbers 8, 9, 7 and 6 in that order. And at 7 p.m., play rate number 15, Sick Woman, Mega Ball and Mega Bonus Balls called. Pick 2, the numbers 35 and 5 in that order, Mega Ball called. Pick 4, the numbers 8, 9, 2 and 1 in that order. Cashbot, the numbers 12, 18, 2, 13 and 3 in any order, and the multiplier is 4.
डैड ने खामका तुम लोग का इतना नुकसान कर दिया, तो मैं यहाँ इसीलिए आई हूँ, कंपनसेट करने के लिए।
ये क्या है?
वो तुम्हें मेरी फ्रेंड याद है जिसके बारे में मैंने तुम्हें बताया था, जो इवेंट ऑर्गेनाइजर है, याद आया? हाँ, तो क्या है ना, वो पूरा अप्रैल बिल्कुल फुल्ली बुक्ड है, बहुत बिजी है, तो वो इवेंट नहीं कर सकती, तो मैंने उससे रिक्वेस्ट करके ये इवेंट तुम लोग को दिला दिया।
एक और इवेंट है जी? मतलब हमने जो इवेंट किया है उसकी बुरी पब्लिसिटी की भरपाई हो जाएगी जी?
मिथिलेश जी, कोई भी पब्लिसिटी बुरी पब्लिसिटी नहीं होती है। एवरी पब्लिसिटी इज गुड पब्लिसिटी।
And that's it there. If we look at it today, there were two things that stood out. One, we were coming out of a period of persistent economic decline. We had not had economic growth for quite a while, but we were just beginning to close the gap between expenditure and deficit and revenue, starting with very low revenues. And the external market was pretty soft for hydrocarbons, our main inflow. And then came the pandemic, which injected into that weak environment the requirement for huge borrowings. So today, when we listen to the Minister of Finance and our expert friends who are with us, I want you to bear that in mind, that whatever situation we are in today, we have come from that location, a location of significant sudden reduction in our revenues, as well as a requirement to deal with demands for increased expenditure in the health sector. And when you look at it that way, you'll be in a better position to determine whether, in fact, we are on the right track, whether we are on the bad track, and what does the future realistically hold for us. We know that there are expectations in all quarters, but what the government had set out to do is to do more with less, knowing that it is quite easy for the population to demand more from less. And against that background, the government holds itself responsible to make the best decisions in what continues to be a difficult situation, but not as difficult as it was when we were here 2020 looking forward into the heart of a pandemic. So ladies and gentlemen, we now have to continue to stay the course. If we don't stay the course, we could undo a lot of the good work that we have done. And in the presentations today, we'll want to identify some of the very specific things that were done. And I would want to say to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that the fiscal behavior of the government of Trinidad and Tobago under these circumstances has been exemplary. We have lost a few friends along the way by doing that. But it was the responsible thing to do, and it continues to be the responsible thing to do because it strengthens us all. Monetary policy, you would have heard some experts predicting the collapse of the economy on a consistent basis. Today I can tell you without fear of contradiction, our economy has not collapsed. As a matter of fact, in the darkest moments of the pandemic, when our retail trade was shut down, and those of little faith thought that that was a symptom of collapse, today I can tell you that our retail trade is almost as vibrant as it has ever been. And it is because of the responsible action taken by the government to ensure that we preserved our hope in a future. And when that future came, that we were in a position to have seeds grow out of a very hard and even possibly infertile ground. I want this morning to congratulate the private sector of Trinidad and Tobago for getting up, taking up our beds and walking back into a future. And that is why today I expect that the Minister of Finance can tell you some good news, that some things are going well. The international market has been good to us price-wise, but over and above the declining revenues and the pandemic, we also had a war in Europe injected into the scheme of things, driving inflation, something that we couldn't escape because of our connection to the outside world. I was looking at the performance of European countries, wealthy European countries. A couple of days ago, they declared across the board a 9.1% inflation in Europe. I don't think the Minister of Finance in Trinidad and Tobago will declare that today in Trinidad and Tobago. But inflation has been one of the injectors into the challenges, the basket of challenges we've had. And coming out of that difficult period, especially driven by the demand, the unquestioned and unquestionable demand of the COVID, we have some legacy items which may and probably would have to find themselves into line items in the budget, not the least of which is the young generation, school-age people, who are carrying a demand now for extra assistance because of what we lost during the 2 years of the COVID response. I was looking at the behavior and the outcome of managing this problem in the richest country in the world, because it's not only about resources, it's about how the population responded and behaved in response to COVID. Richest country in the world, the United States. They have just declared, with respect to the effect of COVID on their school-age population, that well-off children performance declined by 3%. Children who normally would have been having difficulties under normal circumstances, those not underprivileged, but the ones who are not in the top cohort economically, their performance declined by 13% in English and mathematics. And I think that Trinidad and Tobago has similar or possibly worse conditions, which cannot be left unattended. And therefore, this is a new challenge for us, not just to have an ordinary school year, but to have a school year, and maybe more than a school year, in which this is an additional requirement from the budget. And I mention this only to indicate to you that the Minister of Finance will always have challenges, and as one Jamaican Prime Minister said, you always want a caring government, but it takes cash to care. So all the things that we embark upon, the fiscal outturns, are where they will be rooted and will be grounded. So I wouldn't want to take up too much of your time and dampen your eagerness this morning, except to tell you that I too am eager to hear what the Minister of Finance has to say. But I'm confident that in this window of difficulty that we've been through in the last 48 months, the last 36 months thereabouts, that Trinidad and Tobago has done well, and a good spirit of positive, a good spirit of high morale is the best position to be in walking forward into this battle in the local and international community. So thank you for coming, and let's hear what the Ministry of Finance has to say to us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Next, we have our next speaker, Dr. Dave Siraton, is an economist studying the Caribbean and other emerging economies, particularly the financial sector in these economies. He has researched, published, and consulted in areas such as financial innovations, financial regulations, financial market microstructure, global foreign exchange markets, mutual fund performance in the Caribbean, fiscal reforms in the Caribbean, and business strategy and competitiveness in the Caribbean. Dr. Siraton now teaches international money and finance at the graduate level at the Institute of International Relations, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. He headed the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance and served as editor of the Journal of Business, Finance, and Economics in Emerging Economies over the period 2015 to 2017. He has also served as a member of a number of Trinidad and Tobago government cabinet-appointed committees, such as the cabinet-appointed Vision 2020 Financial Services Subcommittee and the cabinet-appointed committee that prepared the white paper on the reform of the financial system in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Siraton has also served on other Caribbean-wide committees on the regional financial system, such as the Caribbean Regional Financial Stability Coordination Council. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Dave Siraton.
Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, President of the Senate, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Honorable Minister of Finance and other Cabinet Ministers, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, secretaries of the Tobago House of Assembly, permanent secretaries, chairman and executive management of state enterprise and statutory authorities, distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. A pleasant good morning to each and every one of you. And I want to first thank the Minister of Finance for inviting me to speak on these issues, which are very dear to my heart as a practicing economist You know, these are exciting times in terms of the kinds of things we discuss in the profession. And, you know, this is a perfect opportunity to deal with some of the issues that we have researched and looked at over a long period of time. Oh, okay. Now, basically what I want to do today, I don't want to concentrate too much on details, just to set the broad parameters, I think, around the challenges that we face, particularly at the international level, and the logic of the kind of policy regime that we have witnessed over the last 7 years in terms of the fiscal consolidation and the attempts at recovery and growth. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the unprecedented nature of the international shocks that we have witnessed, not only in the last 2 years, but started as far back as 2007 with the global financial crisis. As many of you know, that particular crisis was the most costly financial and economic crisis that we had since basically the Great Depressions in the early 1930s. So that just gives you a kind of idea of the magnitude of the shock that that particular event caused for economies around the world. And Trinidad and Tobago, as a small open economy, of course, had to face the fallout from those, that crisis, particularly in the area of financial flows, right? Particularly in the area of financial flows, and of course, commodity prices. As an energy-based economy, of course, those things are important to us. I'll talk a little bit, I don't want to talk too much about the impact on Trinidad and Tobago because I'm sure the Permanent Secretary and the Minister will discuss those issues. And I want to talk a little more about the policy response, looking particularly at crisis management and stabilization and recovery and growth, okay? Now, in terms of the international, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I'm going to summarize. In terms of the shocks that we have faced over the last basically 10 to 12 years, the international financial crisis I mentioned basically started the ball rolling in terms of the shocks that we face. As a matter of fact, as the Prime Minister mentioned, many countries just before the onset of the pandemic were still struggling with legacy issues related to the global financial crisis. So, for example, many countries in the Caribbean had their sovereign debt levels at much higher levels because, of course, they had to deal with some of the fallout from the global financial crisis. And if you have been following the international financial media, you would know that after the 2007-2008 period, the Europeans in particular had sovereign debt issues that pushed the duration of the crisis into 2010, 2011, 2012, and so on. So it is only basically 2017, 2018 that the global economy began to really have a growth that was familiar and similar to the pre-crisis levels. And that is exactly the time when economies were recovering, as the Prime Minister mentioned, that the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And so that we had a very difficult period over the last 2 years because essentially for public health reasons, almost every country in the world had to shut down production in many areas, particularly in sectors that had required face-to-face connections and so on, like tourism. So brothers and sisters in the Caribbean had a particularly terrible time of it. And it's only with the assistance of the multilateral institutions that many of them were able to successfully navigate that particular period. We here in Trinidad and Tobago were relatively fortunate in that we had more significant buffers in terms of foreign exchange reserves and in terms of the funds in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund and so on. But our neighbors in the Caribbean wasn't so fortunate. So I always tell people, even though we had a very torrid time in those 2 years, we could look right next door and see people who would have been glad to be in our shoes, right? So you always have to, when you're going through a difficult period, contextualize where you are and the things that actually make your particular situation better. Now, Global growth, I don't want to talk too much about global growth because I'm sure most people here would be familiar with it because it is in the financial press every day. But global growth is now expected to slow to 3.2% in 2022 from 6.1% in 2021. This is the so-called V-shaped recovery that the IMF was talking about. But because of the challenges we have had in terms of the resurgence of different variants of COVID-19, some of the structural issues in countries in Europe and around the world, as well as the Russia-Ukraine war, that has again intervened at a time when the global economy was just beginning to emerge from the shadows of the pandemic. So again, we are being interrupted, so to speak, in terms of the recovery. And it's likely that we are going to face challenging time ahead. Some of the IMF growth scenarios actually have growth falling to as low as 2.6% in 2022 if certain kinds of risk materialize, for example, the widening of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, the bigger problems in terms of the supply chains, and of course all kinds of problems in the major economies. If you listen to the financial press in the US and so on, and in Europe, as the Prime Minister mentioned, there are huge problems that they face. One of my mentors, Sir Dwight Venner, once said that, you know, when you have a small country, you have small problems. Okay, so in a way, smallness can be an advantage. Okay, so these issues are going to cause significant increase in sovereign debt. I mean, to say people complain about the debt levels in Trinidad and Tobago. I often tell them, just go and look and see what is happening to the debt levels, the sovereign debt levels in Europe, OECD countries, and the only countries that have not really been impacted so much in terms of sovereign debt increases is in Southeast Asia, right? But everybody else basically is in the same boat with respect to increases in sovereign debt, and that is essentially because everybody have gone through these international financial crises, COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine war, and all of them had to expend exceptional amounts to try to deal with these particular crises and so on. So, you know, when we are talking about the performance of the economy and the particular policy regime that we want to roll out, you always have to contextualize by talking about the kinds of challenges we have at the level of the international economy, because all of you would know we are a small, highly open economy, and what happens in the international arena has a huge bearing on how the economy performs. And the Minister of Finance could be a magician, but he would not be able to deal with and correct for most of these problems because of the magnitude of those shocks, and because as well of the fact that we are a small, highly open economy. Okay, so in Trinidad and Tobago, of course, we are familiar with the way in which the economy has performed. And again, when we're talking about performance, you have to talk about the context in which this performance is being recorded. And in the context of the shocks that I mentioned, you know, the cumulative impact of these shocks has had a significant negative impact on a whole range of areas important to the functioning of our economy. And of course, if you are familiar with Caribbean-type economies, you know there were pre-existing vulnerabilities that these shocks actually would have made worse, right? So in that context, I mean to say I wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the Minister of Finance, because it is anybody who is operating in the public financial sector and the public domain in the Caribbean is going through a very torrid time in terms of the challenges that they face. And of course, in terms of the outcomes in the local economy, we have weak economic growth, which started around 2009, that coincided with the CL financial crisis. So we had negative growth in 2009. But if you look at the growth performance from then to the present, we have had fits and starts, some years better than others, but a lot of those years we actually recorded negative growth. And that is understandable in the context of the events that I have been discussing. The worsening of the government financial position in terms of fiscal revenue, the weakening of the balance of payments, higher sovereign debt, and a decline in international reserves. And this is not something that's peculiar to Trinidad and Tobago. This is happening all over the world. Elevated risk in the financial sector, I suppose Dr. Noel, who is here from the central bank, will talk a little bit about that. Rising unemployment, which is one of the most important aspect of the challenges we face, because that has implications for social and political stability, and all economists will know that that social and political stability is a very important ingredient for the performance of economies. A lot of economists do focus on that, but that political economy aspect of policy is very important. And dealing with social issues caused by high unemployment is one of the important challenges that we'll face now and in the future. And of course, the Prime Minister mentioned as well rising inflation caused by increased commodity price, supply bottleneck, and increased freight charges that we have witnessed over the last 2 years. Some of the issues bedeviling the recovery in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, I want to talk about, I'm not going to focus on a lot of detail, but I just want to lay out some of the logic of how countries respond to the economic crisis. So most of you would know, and I think the Minister of Finance talked about this on numerous occasions in his budget presentations, when you're in a crisis, there are two essential stages. The first stage is a stabilization stage, and that is one of the most painful stages. But that is an absolute necessity for the next stage, which is the recovery and growth stage. If you have been following the performance of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, you'd realize, as the Prime Minister mentioned, that we were just about, when the pandemic struck, to be transitioning from that consolidation stage to the recovery and growth stage. And of course, when the pandemic struck, you have to switch gears and focus on other imperatives, right? But again, that requirement to move to that recovery and growth stage is absolutely essential, right? So the fiscal consolidation, the cuts in expenditure, and so on, attempts to increase revenue by a variety of mechanisms is absolutely essential. My own view is that we have cut expenditure very effectively down to a level which I think is the absolute minimum now, Minister, where that is needed for a modern economy like Trinidad and Tobago. And any further adjustment has really to happen on the revenue side, and things like, for example, the Revenue Authority, property taxation, and those kinds of things are actually things that we probably need to focus more on in the future. And if you have been following some of the discussions about our public finances, the IMF actually have estimated in the past that the uncollected taxes is in the region, don't hold me to this, but in the region of about $7 billion. If everybody paid their taxes and we had a very efficient tax collection mechanism in place, we probably will have moved a long way towards correcting, eliminating deficit without necessarily raising taxes or cutting expenditure further, right? So that is something that we have to focus on in the future. Very importantly, the decision not to utilize the exchange rate as the major mechanism for driving the stabilization effort is hugely important. I mean to say, I have all kinds of disagreement with my colleagues in the university. Some of them are in favor of a much more aggressive approach using the exchange rate. But I tell them, my PhD thesis is in foreign exchange market. You have to understand the psychological aspect of the foreign exchange market. You don't implement significant changes in the foreign exchange market in the midst of a crisis. Agents in the market will run for the hill, right? So the decision by the Minister of Finance and the government to actually use the exchange rate system that we have to anchor expectation on prices is absolutely essential. Just imagine if we were in a regime where we had a more flexible approach to the exchange rate and COVID struck, right? The minister will not only have to be dealing with these issues, but he will have to be worrying every Monday morning about what agents in the foreign exchange market will be doing to cause chaos in the foreign exchange market, right? So it is not only bad from an economic standpoint in terms of that particular policy option. It's bad from a strategic point in terms of understanding how the economies function and how different agents in the market operate and the incentive structure for these different agents and so on. So that was an absolutely critical ingredient of a successful stabilization policy. And even if you don't understand all the details about the economic logic of this particular arrangement, all you have to do is look to the north in Jamaica and in Guyana, in Suriname, in terms of countries who attempted to use the exchange rate as the major tool in the adjustment exercises, right? And the Jamaicans haven't recovered I have friends in Jamaica for 20 years, right? So people who talk about changing the exchange rate willy-nilly really either don't know what they're talking about, or two, have ulterior motives, which is not in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago. Of course, the whole issue about debt is also a very topical issue, and I tell people all the time that what are you going to do? If government removes its footprint or reduces its footprints in the economy at the same time that the private sector is scaling back aggregate demand, then you're going to have an even bigger problem in the economy in terms of employment, incomes, and so on. So the government cannot reduce its footprints in the economy in this particular time. That may come in the future when the private sector has recovered fully and so on, but not now. So that again is a very important part of the equation in terms of a successful adjustment period. And very importantly, the domestic financial system has weathered the shocks relatively well because of the unprecedented interventions by regulators, governments, international financial institutions, and private market participants themselves, because the commercial banks during the pandemic actually cooperated by deferring loan payments and so on, understanding the kind of situation that we were in and so on. And of course, we leveraged very successfully international and regional cooperation to deal with the crisis and so on. And of course, I'm sure Dr. Noel will talk about the relatively strong international buffer position we have in terms of international reserves. It's not as high as we would like it to be, but it is way better than some of our counterparts in the region. The unfinished reform agenda, of course, has to do the second part, which is the recovery and growth phase. And even if you look at the IMF and IMF advice, they're very strong on the stabilization part of the equation, but the analytical frameworks for policy is not very strong in terms of the supply side, in terms of giving countries advice about how to reinvigorate the productive systems and so on. The World Bank is also better at that, but even the World Bank doesn't have the intellectual capacity to adequately provide a comprehensive policy framework for the recovery and growth phase. And that leaves it to the local expertise and local solutions and so on, right? So some of the things that we could do centers around improving the ease of doing business. Businessmen routinely complain about some of the loopholes, some of the hurdles they have to overcome to do business in the country. You have to incentivize entrepreneurial behavior, systematically reduce import intensity, which is a very important thing. And so for example, trying to increase agricultural production is only one in a number of different things that you could do to kind of reduce import intensity. You have to redouble efforts to increase economic diversification, and in that respect, you know, the development of the tourism industry in Tobago is absolutely low-hanging fruit, because the Caribbean already have a very good brand in the international tourism industry, so that is easy. That is relatively easy to push forward in that area. You need, of course, to improve productivity. All the studies that we have looked at on the performance of Trinidad and Tobago have flagged low productivity as one of the things holding business back. And of course, you need to accelerate fintech adoption, enhance system for cross-border payment and remittances. And remittances is a very important element going forward, because this is a form of financing that other countries in the region have used successfully to deal with some of the challenges they face. And of course, finally, you have to deal more frontally with the inequalities which have serious implications for sustainable growth and social and political stability. And this is probably one of the most important planks of your strategy because, as you would know, people at the lowest rungs in the society are the people who normally fare the worst when these kinds of events happen. And there is a lot of research that actually shows that the higher your level of inequality in the country, the lower the levels of growth, sustainable growth in the particular economy. So if you don't have, if you're not driven by a need to improve the lot of your fellow men, it's absolutely essential in the context of making your economy more resilient and so on. So I would stop there, and I will be happy to answer any questions that the participants may have in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siritan. Next, we have Dr. Dorian Noel, who is currently the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago and the Governor of the Board of Governors of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund of Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Noel is a former Commonwealth Scholar to the ICMA Center Business School for Financial Markets at Henley Business School, University of Reading, where he obtained his PhD in finance. He is also a former Commonwealth Academic Fellow to the Systemic Risk Center, London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Noel holds a Chartered Alternative Investment Analyst professional designation from the CAIA Association. In recognition of his outstanding contributions to the advancement of the Institute of Banking and Finance of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Noel was conferred with the title of Fellow of the Institute of Banking and Finance of Trinidad and Tobago in 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, I present a son of the soil of San Fernando, with whom we are all well pleased, Dr. Dorian Noel.
Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, President of the Senate, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Honorable Minister of Finance and other Cabinet Ministers, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of Senate and the House of Representatives, secretaries of the Tobago House of Assembly, permanent secretaries, chairman, executive management of state enterprises and statutory authorities, distinguished guests, members of the media. Good morning. On behalf of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, we would like to wish you a happy 60th independence. I would also like to take this opportunity to note that the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago was created merely 2 years after our independence, in December 1964. Since then, we have worked assiduously to maintain the country's monetary and financial stability. We have done quite a good job. In fact, we have done an excellent job. And we will continue to do so with the same vigor and diligence since our creation. My presentation this morning will be short and focus mainly on providing an appropriate economic context for our discussion this morning. I will start with the pre-COVID economic conditions and conclude with a short economic outlook. pre-COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019, the economy was on a path to recovery following the adverse 2014 oil price shock. Real GDP declined by a mere 2.2%. The energy sector was still operating below capacity, but recovery of the non-energy sector solidified, growing by 2.7%. Labor market were favorable, unemployment was 4.3%, and headline inflation remained low and stable at 1%. On the fiscal front, fiscal consolidation efforts narrowed the deficit to a low 2.5% of GDP. Adjusted general government debt at 62% of GDP. Monetary and financial conditions were broadly supportive, with the repo rate at 5%. On the external front, Trinidad and Tobago continue to record healthy current account surpluses, 4.4% of GDP in 2019, and net official reserve was roughly $7 billion, 7.7 months of import cover. In 2020, the COVID pandemic disrupted the country recovery process. Were it not for the sizable financial buffers, international reserve, and the Heritage and Stabilization Fund of approximately $13 billion, the domestic economy risks being permanently shipwrecked. Similar to other countries, extraordinary fiscal and monetary measures were taken to contain the economic fallout of the pandemic. Government provided support to household and firm, expanding the social safety net at a significant cost. Understandably, the fiscal deficit ballooned to 11.2% of GDP, while adjusted general government debt rose to around 80% of GDP. Central Bank acted promptly to stabilize the monetary and financial conditions. As early as March 2020, the repo rate was cut by 150 basis points to 3.5%. Commercial bank reserve requirements was reduced by 3 percentage points to 14%, adding liquidity to markets. On the regulatory front, the bank collaborated with lending institutions on the implementation of loan moratoriums. Finally, regulatory forbearance was applied to the treatment of past loans. The measure taken to contain the spread of the virus weighed heavily on the domestic economy, and this is true for most countries. Real GDP plummeted by 7.4%, driven by a 12.2% decline in the energy sector, which faced a collapse in global demand. With the closure of several businesses, unemployment rose to 5.7%, with those employed in the service sector most affected. On the positive side, headline inflation slipped to 1% due to the collapse in aggregate demand. I will turn to the current economic environment. In 2022, the pandemic effects are fading, but the virus still remains a risk to the domestic economy. The energy sector continues to be plagued by production challenges. However, high international energy prices are supporting a revival. With respect to the non-energy sector, the bank preliminary estimate revealed that activities expanded by 1% in Q1 2022. Inflation has picked up, but has remained broadly contained compared to our major trading partners. Additional inflows have bolstered the government fiscal account. And I'm sure PS and Lishi are going to give us more up-to-date figures. But from the bank record, the government recorded a surplus of roughly $3 billion TT, during the first 9 months of fiscal 2022. With the reopening of the economy, private sector credit has expanded since fourth quarter 2021. Business lending has sustained a positive momentum to June 2022. Business lending recorded a 12% year-on-year growth in June of this year. However, consumer lending has been slow to respond, only turning positive in May 2022, a 1.5% year-on-year growth. Reserves have come down significantly. Excess reserve has come down significantly, falling to a daily average of $2.5 billion in June 2022, but climbed just over $4 billion in the month of August. Meanwhile, international reserve, though declining, remained adequate at $6.7 billion in August 2022, roughly 8.2 months of import cover. The financial system has maintained stability on the whole, and based on the current assessed risk levels, and assuming no adverse movement, is likely to maintain stable, mainly because financial institutions have sufficient capital levels. The bank monetary stand has remained largely supportive. Repo rate has remained at 3.5% since March 2020, and the bank continues to ensure that the domestic financial market remains adequately liquid to support credit expansion. Looking out to the horizon. Globally, the world economy is transitioning from an economic environment which lasted roughly about 12 years and featured low interest rates, low and stable price levels, and fairly predictable and stable trade and foreign relations. The new economic reality is still to be properly defined because of high uncertainties with respect to the path of monetary actions, geopolitical tensions, and climate change transition risks. Inevitable macro surprises relating to cyber attacks and biological viruses add to the uncertainty. On the balance of risks previously mentioned, over the next 12 months, global markets and economic conditions will likely remain volatile, punctuated by periods of drawdowns and upturns. Major central bank monetary policy rates will have to move higher to maintain inflation at acceptable levels. Locally, export prices are likely in the near months to remain high and gradually adjust downwards as geopolitical tension and supply chain effects fade. The slowing global growth will impact demand. With regards to the risk balance, risks are skewed to the downside for the time being. Hence, we have to be adequately prepared for the possibility of a much earlier and rapid downward reversal in prices. In such circumstances, it is extremely important that we, as a country, immediately focus on rebuilding and enhancing our economic buffers, which has no doubt weakened by the COVID-19 pandemic and further challenged by the current global economic environment and the acceleration of climate change transition risks. Having adequate economic buffers ensure that the country has the internal capacity to absorb future macro shocks. In addition, we have to be extremely prudent and perhaps err on the side of caution in weighing policy consideration over the short and medium term. Poor or misaligned policy choices may delay the return to sustainable growth, or require corrective adjustment at a later date. Domestic prices will push higher in the short run as firms continue to adjust prices upward to reflect market conditions. The overall economy will benefit from a full year of the removal of COVID-19 restriction and largely favorable export prices. But I want to note that there are still sizable downside risks. In closing, the bank will continue to prudently weigh external and internal factors in determining its monetary stance, ensuring that monetary tools and instruments are appropriate for stable and sustainable growth. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Noel. Moving along, next we have the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Mrs. Suzette Taylor-Leachy. She had been appointed Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance with effect from January 1st, 2021. Mrs. Taylor-Leachy previously served as Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance from 2017 to 2020, and as Deputy Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance from 2014 to 2017. Mrs. Leachy began her career at the Ministry of Finance in September 1992 as Economist 1, assigned to the Monetary, Fiscal and Trade Division. She was subsequently appointed to the post of Economist 2 and Senior Economist in the Coordinating and Monitoring Unit of the Ministry of Finance, and successively as Assistant Director, Economic Management Division, or EMD, Macro Fiscal Unit. Between 2009 and 2010, she was assigned to the World Bank in Washington, D.C. as the Government of Trinidad and Tobago's representative to the World Bank, situated in the Office of the Executive Director with responsibility for Brazil, Colombia, the Philippines, Suriname, Haiti, Ecuador, the Dominican Republic, and Trinidad and Tobago. Upon her return from Washington, D.C., Mrs. Taylor-Leachy was again assigned to the EMD, but this time as Assistant Director in charge of the Debt Management Unit. Mrs. Taylor-Leachy possesses a BSc degree in Economics from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and a Master's of Business Administration from the Heriot-Watt University, 2007. She has also benefited from numerous training programs and seminars on various topics of relevance to the Ministry of Finance, including fiscal policy, financial programming, and debt management. Ladies and gentlemen, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Mrs. Suzette Taylor-Leachy.
Thank you, Minister Manning. Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Honorable Minister of Finance and other Cabinet members, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Secretaries of the Tobago House of Assembly, Permanent Secretaries, Chairmen and Executive Management of State Enterprises and Statutory Authorities, distinguished guests, members of the media. It is indeed an honor to participate in this morning's proceedings and to be given the opportunity to share some insights into central government's fiscal operations, which is essentially government's revenue, expenditure, financing, and debt. And we like to throw in cash flows into that mix at the Ministry of Finance. My focus this morning will be on the current fiscal 2022 year, but I will first seek to place our present realities into context by initially giving a brief overview of a wider 15-year period of fiscal operations from 2007 to 2022. Right. So a key factor in any discussion on the central government fiscal operations is oil and gas revenue, which has historically been the most significant contributor to total revenue. But one characteristic of this revenue earner, of course, is that it has been pretty volatile over the last few years. Following a peak of 52.7% or $29.96 billion of total revenue in fiscal 2007-2008, revenues from oil and gas plummeted to 7.6% or $3.43 billion in fiscal 2015-2016. These revenues have gradually increased to 16.5% of total revenue, or about $6.14 billion last year. This year, we expect that revenues from oil and gas would comprise about 36% of our revenue, or about $18.5 billion. Other significant sources of revenue, of course, taxes on income, which is the orange line, taxes on goods and services, which is mainly VAT, and non-tax revenue, which is principally royalties, and incidentally also counted as part of oil and gas revenue. Skipping ahead, this slide looks at the correlation between total revenue, total expenditure, and oil and gas prices between 2007 and 2022. Between 2007 to 2014, revenue and expenditure tracked oil and gas revenues very directly. So in 2008, when oil prices averaged about $107.7 US per barrel, and gas was about US $9 per MMBTU, total revenue was $56.87 billion. That was the last year over this 15-year period that we recorded a fiscal surplus. Or put more simply, it was the last year that we spent less than we earned in this 15-year period. The other spike in oil and gas prices, as illustrated in this graph, happened in 2014, when oil prices were averaging close to US $100 per barrel, and gas prices was $4.40 per MMBTU. However, in this year, while revenue had increased to $58.4 billion, expenditure was almost $62 billion. And as a result, in spite of the relatively high revenue, we still recorded a deficit of about $3.54 billion in that year. What is noteworthy is that in the years when oil revenues contributed less and less to total revenues, we had been able to sustain revenue levels by drawing on one-off revenue items, such as dividends from state enterprises, which were more than $11 billion between fiscal 2013-2014 and fiscal 2014-2015. Other items under that category included sale of assets, including public offerings of state enterprises, such as FCB, and we also over the years have received revenues from the recovery of CLICO assets, among others. But notwithstanding the fact that we were able to boost revenues from these one-off items, as I indicated earlier, we nevertheless recorded continuous deficit over this period. These deficits were financed via borrowings and more recently via drawdowns from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Also noteworthy in this graph is the fact that in the 2 years immediately preceding this one, Trinidad and Tobago recorded two of the largest fiscal deficits ever recorded, $16.69 billion in 2020 and $12.35 billion in 2021. Of course, this was a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the economy was basically shuttered and the government sought to provide, as most governments throughout the world did, a previously unprecedented level of support to the citizenry in many varied forms. Of course, the last column of this graph indicates that this year we expect that revenue and expenditure will be more closely aligned with a much lower deficit than in the immediately preceding years. Okay. Skipping ahead to focus now more closely on the current fiscal year, starting with revenue, this slide gives a comparison of our original budget estimate for revenue versus our current working estimates for revenue as at July 5th, 2022. So, in that regard, and with 10 months of actual revenue collections thus far, we are confident that revenue this year will be around $51.5 billion. This is about $8 billion more than budgeted. This increased revenue is expected to come almost exclusively from taxes on income and profits, with an additional $4.2 billion from oil companies and $3.8 billion from other companies. And those increases will compensate for a shortfall in individual income tax, $5.99 billion as opposed to $6.25 billion, and this we attribute to the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on employment. Under taxes on goods and services, which is mainly VAT, our revised working estimates for 2022 is actually lower than the original budgeted figure. So currently, we expect to collect about $5.8 billion in VAT by the end of the year, which is significantly lower than the $7.2 billion we expected at the start of the year. This, however, is directly due to the fact that as revenue improved during the year, the government would have accelerated payout of VAT refunds. So, as a result, net VAT collections in this year will be lower than originally budgeted. Recall that over the past years, we would have had an accumulation of VAT refunds due, and so as we received additional revenue over the year, during the year, we really made an effort to accelerate the payouts of VAT refunds. The other major category of revenue is non-tax revenue, which of course is principally royalties on oil and gas companies. Under this item, royalties is anticipated to exceed the budgeted target by about $500 million. And this, of course, is also related to global energy prices. Equity profits from the central bank, another component of non-tax revenue. Here we expect to collect about $300 million less than budgeted, and that is not an entirely bad situation since it ultimately reflects lower than anticipated usage of the central bank overdraft by the central government during the current fiscal year, which means that we have paid less interest on the overdraft to the central bank. They in turn have made less profits, and so they are remitting less profits to the central government. Under capital revenue, we have a figure of $1.1 billion on the sale of assets, which represents proceeds from the FCB additional public offering, as well as from the ongoing process to settle CLECO liabilities to the central government. Moving ahead and focusing on our expenditure expectations for this fiscal year, the Ministry of Finance has revised its estimate for expenditure from $52.4 billion at the start of fiscal 2022 to $55.189 billion as at the mid-year review of the budget in May 2022. While this remains our official working estimate for expenditure, with 11 months of the fiscal year behind us, we think that actual revenue will fall short of this target in the vicinity of around $53 billion, which is still higher than our original budget estimate of $52.4 billion. One component of this increased expenditure is additional outlays under goods and services of approximately $1 billion. It should be noted that during the months and years prior, when we would have had cash flow constraints, expenditure under this item would have been suppressed. So, as the cash flows improved this year, the Ministry of Finance has made a concerted attempt to facilitate more releases under this category, hence the additional $1 billion in expenditure. The main component of expenditure continues to be transfers and subsidies, which account for more than half of our total expenditure, about 54% to be exact. However, this is a very broad category of expenditure, and it covers a range of items, including all social assistance payment, transfers to state enterprises and statutory bodies for debt service and operational expenditure, transfers to the THA, transfers in respect of GATE, and of course, transfers in respect of the fuel subsidy. So the original estimate under transfers and subsidy was $28.1 billion, which was increased in the mid-year review to $29.85. And the increase, it covers a range of items from additional funds for the Children's Authority, for pensions and gratuities, for the TNTech electricity rebate program, for the fuel subsidy, of course, for the COVID-19 food support or market boxes program, for the senior citizens grant, for the infrastructure development fund, for our ambulance service, GMRTT, and for the RHAs. Capital expenditure appears to be progressing pretty much as originally budgeted and is expected to reach the target of $4.2 billion by the end of this fiscal year. What we are doing as we move towards the end of the fiscal year in respect of the Infrastructure Development Fund is to move unutilized balances under some projects to other projects that have momentum and require additional funding. And these projects are mainly road infrastructure projects under the Ministry of Works. So the final line of the slide, of course, is one that we are pretty familiar with. It indicates that we expect to end the year with a much smaller deficit than originally expected, in the order of about $3.7 billion, as opposed to our original estimate of around $9 billion. As indicated previously, it is likely that expenditure will be less than our current working estimates, so we expect that this deficit will be lower than $3.7 billion. This slide just gives a brief look at how we expect to finance the deficit. The sources of funding for the deficit are, of course, local or foreign loans from the banking sector and multilateral institutions, from the central bank overdraft. And in recent years, we have used the drawdowns from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to finance the deficit. This year, we expect to fund approximately $790 million via foreign loans, mainly from multilateral sources such as the Andean Development Bank, or CAF. The remaining balance of the deficit will be met from local sources. In this slide, we provided some further details on revenue broken down in terms of monthly cash flows. This slide illustrates the fact that revenue inflows at the end of the quarter months tend to be considerably higher because companies, according to law, pay their taxes on a quarterly basis. We also see a slight uptick in revenue in the first month of each quarter when royalties are paid. So the middle month of any quarter tends to be a month with the least cash flow. This year at the Ministry of Finance, we have had the luxury of carrying forward positive cash balances that could cover expenditures in those lean middle months and the other months. However, for all of last year and many years before that, and most notably in fiscal 2020 and 2021, that is during the COVID period, we generally did not have any significant amount of cash to carry forward to the next month. During this period, the Ministry of Finance engaged in very careful cash flow management, coordinated by our Economic Management Division in close and continuous collaboration with our revenue collectors, the Indian Revenue Division, and the Customs and Excise Division, the Treasury Division, who is responsible for the government's bank accounts, the Budget Division, who are charged with approving releases to ministries and agencies, and our Debt Management Division, who were kept very busy arranging borrowings that for many months bridged the gap between revenue and expenditure. I have to say that these exercises still continue in the Ministry of Finance, although this year it has not been as stringent as in previous years. And just a slight introduction here, next year we hope to go live with an information management system throughout the public service as part of our Public Financial Management Modernization Project. Through this system and the wider PFM project, we hope to automate the entire budget process from requests for releases to revenue management and audit. So in that regard, we hope and expect that cash flow management and forecasting and budget execution as a whole will be more efficient and less resource intensive. This slide provides a monthly breakdown of expenditure, and it gives a sense of the amount of cash that the Ministry of Finance must identify each month to meet the government's spending obligations. It is a well-known fact that in recent years, as the Ministry of Finance grappled with dwindling cash flows, we have had to engage in severe expenditure restraint, mainly through delays and non-approval of requests for releases by ministries and agencies. Here we have to make a distinction between appropriations, which is the authority to spend, which is given by Parliament at the time of the budget, versus the ability to spend, which requires actual cash flow. So while ministries and agencies have the authority to spend, they cannot actually spend until the Ministry of Finance releases the fund to them. And that is, of course, is a direct function of the available cash on hand. As indicated earlier, we at the Ministry of Finance have had to be very circumspect in making these releases over the past years, because we never want to be in a position where a government check cannot be honored. But I have to emphasize, notwithstanding our cash flow constraints, we have always been careful to prioritize releases for all forms of expenditure that is deemed to be mandatory. This would include all salary and salary-related payments for public sector and contract staff. For the THA, we also prioritize releases for all forms of social expenditure, including the Senior Citizens Grant, Disability Grant, Social Assistance Grant, Urgent Temporary Assistance Grant, etc. We also deemed as mandatory all debt service of both the central government and of those statutory authorities and state enterprises which are serviced by the central government. Right, so moving ahead. This slide gives us just a quick breakdown of expenditure by mandatory and non-mandatory categorizations. As you can see, we have been progressively releasing more funds to meet these items that we would have previously deemed to be non-mandatory. In fact, I can say that currently we are able to and have been making a concerted attempt to honor all requests for releases, with any delays at this point being due to lack of proper documentation to support the request. And we sincerely hope to continue in this vein in the new fiscal year. And finally, just to round up the discussion, a focus on debt. This slide provides an overview of general government debt over the first 10 months of the fiscal year. It indicates that between October 2021 and July 2022, we saw a distinct reduction in the pace of acceleration of new debt. In that regard, adjusted general government debt, which includes the debt of the central government, as well as all government guaranteed debt that is serviced by the central government, increased by a mere 1.6% from 126.8 billion at the end of September 2021, to 128.8 billion at the end of July 2022. This compares to an almost 7% increase between 2020 and 2021. Staying on debt, relatedly, this slide looks at the entire debt portfolio and specifically indicates when each debt is required to be paid. It is what we refer to as the central government's debt maturity profile, and it is a key piece of information that the ministry uses in decision-making related to debt and other fiscal matters. Each bar of the graph shows the amount of debt the government has to repay each year from now until 2045. And of course, it includes not only the direct debt of the central government, but also the debt of those state enterprises and statutory authorities that are assisted in their debt payments by the central government. So each year, as part of our planning, we have to decide how we are going to meet these debt obligations. The options available to us to repay are to repay the debt as they come due from budgetary resources or from revenue. We can also refinance or roll over the debt, and that involves taking out a new loan, domestic or foreign, to pay off the maturing loan. So for example, this year the government had debt service obligations of $14.2 billion, which we have been repaying via a combination of refinancing and direct repayments from budgetary resources. The $14.2 billion debt service comprises $8.8 billion in principal repayments and $5.3 billion in interest. And remember, these payments are not only for the central government, but they're also in relation to some state enterprises and statutory bodies whose debt the government services via transfers to these entities. So you would see that those figures under the transfers and subsidy component of the fiscal accounts. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, while this year has been challenging, less challenging than recent years, the recovery is ongoing, and we at the Ministry of Finance are mindful of the many attendant risks and remain vigilant and committed to the task ahead. I thank you most sincerely and look for your attention and look forward to the rest of this morning's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary Lichi, for that extremely informative presentation. Next, I have the distinct honor to present to you our feature speaker, a gentleman with whom we are all well acquainted. Ladies and gentlemen, the Minister of Finance of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Colm Imbert.
Good morning. Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, my cabinet colleagues, other distinguished members of the panel on the head table, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, again, good morning. I am going to rely on a series of slides this morning. If we go to the first slide, I think it needs to be emphasized that the world is going through an exceptional series of unexpected shocks, and that these shocks are generating widespread financial pressure and distress for emerging markets. However, in Trinidad and Tobago, the credibility that we earned in previous years allowed the government to protect the population as much as possible and considerably more than in many comparable economies. Our policies were aimed at supporting production in the oil and gas and petrochemical sectors, allowing us to reap the benefits of the current favorable price dynamics. Our policies have supported a broad-based and robust recovery of the Trinidadian economy, which you will see in a short while, resulting in an improvement in our key credit rating drivers and revealing a previously underestimated financial resilience. We aim to transform the current momentum into structural achievements. This next slide gives you some illustration of what I just spoke about. March 2020, start of the COVID pandemic. November to December 2021, inflation begins in the US and Europe. March to May 2022, the historic supply shock to oil and gas. Brent reaches $120 a barrel. Henry Hub crosses $8 per MMBTU. In April 2020, if I go back to 2020, we suffered a shock of Brent going below $20 a barrel. And in fact, in 2020, we had the unprecedented event of the price of West Texas Intermediate going to zero and entering negative territory. In fact, if I digress, our national oil company, Heritage Petroleum, had to store oil until the price of oil returned to above $30, which allowed Heritage to sell oil at a profit. If Heritage had sold oil when the price was below $30, they would have suffered a loss. They took a very wise decision to store oil, and the oil price recovered. In February 22, war in Ukraine. And now we have another shock. In June 2022, the Federal Reserve, trying to deal with inflation in the United States, does a rate hike by 75 basis points, or 0.75%. First time the Federal Reserve has done that since 1994. This has caused turbulence and instability in world stock markets. And those of you who follow the equity markets in the United States will have seen over the last week, the Federal Reserve doesn't even have to do anything. They just have to venture an opinion as to whether they are going to increase interest rates, and the stock markets in the United States tumble. So that's the next unprecedented shock that we are experiencing. Just let me go back. Sorry about that. This slide gives you some understanding of what's going on. The top area is the changes in equity prices. So you will see from 1994 coming up, you had a fairly progressive stock market. You had a fairly progressive increase in equities. But look at what has happened in this year, 2022. You have capital outflows of 18%, negative capital outflows of 18%. And this is the kind of thing that precipitates a financial currency crisis. When you look below the slide at the bottom right, the IMF lending has more than doubled in the last 5 years, which gives you an indication of the kind of problems that countries are facing. In our case, the fiscal credibility that we earned over the last 7 years allowed us to access substantial financing during the COVID-19 crisis to protect and support the population. And I'll show you in a short while what occurred when we did that. At the bottom, just by way of mention, I'll show you where we are in terms of vaccination. We're doing quite well in the region. The only countries that I'm aware of that are ahead of us slightly, Guyana and Barbados. But at 51%, Trinidad and Tobago is way ahead of the Bahamas, Grenada, Jamaica. Look at Jamaica, for example. Only 24% of their population is fully vaccinated. If I go to the next slide now, this gives you some idea of what has been happening since the invasion of Ukraine. The slide on the top left is oil prices. You will see what happened when COVID-19 came. As I indicated, oil prices went to zero. I believe that was in February of 2020. But look at what has happened since the invasion of Ukraine. They've gone from zero all the way up to 100 and maintaining that. And there's a lot of manipulation in the market. Over the last week, we saw oil prices increase by $10 and decrease by $10. Today, I looked at it again. Yesterday, oil prices were down. Today, they were up. There's a lot of manipulation. And there's a reason for that. Because that is driving inflation in the developed countries and creating severe political problems for the leadership in those countries. If you look at current affairs, if you look at what is happening in the United States, in Europe, the UK, and so on, all of those governments are grappling with the excess inflation that has been caused by this phenomenal increase in the price of oil. Similarly, gas, if you look on the top right, you see what's going on with Henry Hub. I have another slide which I'll show you in a little while, where we experienced Henry Hub prices for gas below $2 in 2017 and so on. Henry Hub is now $9. It's almost back to where it was when we first started to export our LNG back in 2007 when Henry Hub hit $13. And Henry Hub of its own is not even a proper representation of the benefits we are getting from the increases in the price of gas. Because our LNG is exported to Europe, it's exported to the Far East, exported to South America, where the prices of natural gas are much higher. On the bottom of this slide, you see again something that is really helping the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. And this is the change in the prices of petrochemicals. The blue line is ammonia, the yellow line is urea, and the one at the bottom is methanol. But the one that has really surprised everyone is ammonia. Ammonia has more than tripled in price over the last 2 years. In terms of going forward, this is what we expect. A lot of this will depend on the work being done by the Ministry of Energy and by the Honorable Prime Minister himself in negotiations with all of the oil majors. But we expect that this is what we're going to see in terms of oil and gas production going forward, a steady, gradual uptick in oil and gas production. But it's a lot of hard work. If I go now to this slide, this gives you an understanding of what we have been dealing with. If you go to 2018, 2019, you see that oil was steadily increasing from $40 to $50 to $60, and then it dropped all the way back down in 2020, averaging out at $40 for that year. Now it's 101. If you look at the blue line below, that gives you an understanding of what's going on with natural gas prices. They had dropped, as I indicated, in 1 year below $2, and now $6 is the average up to July 2022. And now, today, natural gas is somewhere in the vicinity of $9. Look at the next slide. This is another area where we are experiencing a windfall. Ammonia prices. Look at how it has jumped from around $250 back in 2020 to an average of $1,000 per metric ton for ammonia. This has changed the whole profile of government revenue. This is a very interesting slide. If you look at 2016, it's in the middle. Look at what happened. In the 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14 period, oil and gas revenue was in the vicinity of 40% of government revenue. We, as a PNM government, coming in September 2015, look at what we had to deal with. Oil and gas revenue dropped to 7% of revenue. 7%. It has now begun to climb back up and is now 35% of government revenue. In terms of our reserves, I heard Dr. Siratan speak about the wisdom of our decision not to devalue the dollar. But there's a particular point I want to make with this slide. The yellow-orange line is our import cover. And you will notice that from 2019 onwards, our import cover has actually been increasing. It had dropped to below 8 months of import cover in 2018 or so. It is now in excess of 8 months of import cover. And if you look at the blue line below, that's our foreign reserves. You see they have stabilized. In fact, we are getting significant inflows of foreign exchange coming in now, which have allowed us a lot of flexibility in terms of those special windows that we have at the Exim Bank for manufacturers and importers of essential items. But the interesting thing about this slide, I heard Dr. Siratan say that many of his colleagues, they have disagreements about what we should have done with our exchange rate. We were advised in 2015 to immediately devalue the dollar to 10 to 1. We were told if we did not do that, our foreign reserves would evaporate in 1 to 2 years. 7 years later, look where our foreign reserves are. Still close to $7 billion US. And import cover, 8 months of import cover. And the point Dr. Siratan made is very important. What would have happened if we devalued the dollar to 10 to 1? Poverty, in my opinion, because there would have been an immediate increase in the cost of living. There was another one who advised us only to spend what we earn. Again, Dr. Siratan made the point that we have reduced expenditure to the point where we should not reduce it anymore. We need to start increasing expenditure. And of course, the solution to that is better revenue collection, which is what the Revenue Authority is all about and what the introduction of property tax is all about. Better revenue collection, which allows us to spend more. Because we cut expenditure by $10 billion a year. We have to start increasing it. There's been a lot of belt tightening over the last 7 years. If I go to the next slide, Ms. Leachy would have given you a form of this slide. But if you look at the green and blue lines, the yellow line and the green line, the yellow line is the overall balance of our accounts. You see how it dropped way down to a deficit of $17 billion in 2020 under COVID. $17 billion is what we had to finance the economy with, using withdrawals from the Heritage Fund and borrowing in 2020. $17 billion. And you will see in another slide I'm going to show you very soon that we have narrowed the deficit from 17 billion, still crunching the numbers, but I think I can confidently say that our deficit for 2022 will be $2 billion. We started off this year with a projected deficit of $9 billion. And I think we're going to end the year with a deficit of $2 billion. And when you look at where it was in 2020, $17 billion in financing. Essential. We had to do it. We had to do it to keep the country running. This slide gives you some indication of where we're getting our revenue from. The red line below is oil companies. So that with the windfall that is coming in from increased commodity prices, our collections from oil companies are going up significantly. But what's interesting is the blue line. The blue line is the non-oil sector. Notice it's also going up. And there's a fallacy that people talk about in terms of our economy and the structure of our economy. In terms of GDP and in terms of revenue, our non-oil sector has been the major contributor to revenue and GDP for at least the last 6 years. Oil does not dominate revenue and GDP in Trinidad and Tobago. If I go to the next slide, this is just another illustration of what's happening in terms of our revenue collection. The blue line needs some explanation. The PS explained it to some extent. The blue line is value-added tax. Every time we do refunds, the net amount of value-added tax goes down because the collection of value-added tax is measured on a net basis. So you have to look at the gross collections and then subtract the refunds. So that is why you have up and down shape in value-added tax. But of course, as the Prime Minister was mentioning to me, we have some tax collection issues which we will certainly seek to deal with the Revenue Authority. We should be collecting much more than that in VAT. This is another illustration just to give you a better idea. The top line is taxes on incomes and profits. The middle line is value-added tax. And the one below is customs duty, which has remained relatively stable over the last several years. This slide gives you an example of illustration of what we had to deal with. Just look at it. In 2014, the revenue from oil and gas, taxes and royalties, $19 billion. That's what the previous administration were able to get. In fact, if you look at the period 2010 to 2015, 18 billion, 17 billion, 19 billion. That is what they were able to get from petroleum. The blue line is total revenue from petroleum. Look at what we had to face with. 2016, 1.7 billion. So we came in after a government that was experiencing revenue collection from petroleum in the order of $18 billion and $19 billion per year, and we had to grapple with $1.7 billion. 1.7. As you can see, it's improving. We expect in 2021, 22, it's gone back up to 6 billion, and we expect in this fiscal year, it will be significantly more. Now, all of this, together with all our policies, have, actually, let's take a look at this slide. This slide gives you an illustration of what is really happening in Trinidad and Tobago. On the left-hand side, that is per capita GDP. The blue line in particular shows our per capita GDP, which is now in the vicinity of $19,000 US per capita. We are now almost the highest per capita income country in the entire Caribbean, above Barbados. I think the only country that's above us is the Bahamas. But look on the right-hand side of the slide. The blue line was where the experts expected our debt to GDP levels to be. 80%, 88%, 85%. The red line is where our debt to GDP levels have really been. We had projected, if things had continued in the way we had expected, we had projected that we'll be facing a debt to GDP ratio of somewhere in the vicinity of 90%. Look at where it is, 72%, and going down. And when you have a debt to GDP ratio of that level, and when the curve is going down, it gives you the fiscal space to spend more money, in the productive sector. So let's go to, just one second. Let's go to this slide. This slide illustrates what's happening with the Trinidad and Tobago economy. It's an indication of gross domestic product. The various sectors are stripped out there. The one in the middle is overall GDP. The green line is energy, and the blue line is non-energy. I want you to look very closely at 2019. Both Dr. Noel and Dr. Siratan have made the point that if it were not for the COVID-19 pandemic, our economy would have come into balance in and around 2019, 2020. As you can see in 2020, look at what happened to us. The energy sector declined by 12%. The overall economy declined by 7.7%, and the non-oil sector declined by 6.2%. But I'm very happy to show you this slide today. Look at what is happening now. We're now above the line. We're now moving into positive territory. And I expect with prudent fiscal management, our economy will continue along that upward trend, continuing in positive territory. 2020 has turned out to be an inflection point. And as we move, we expect continued recovery in the Trinidad and Tobago economy. I wanted to show you this slide. It's a very interesting slide. The countries in blue are all worse off than Trinidad and Tobago in terms of the current account balance. And look at what they are. Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Argentina, Panama, Barbados, the Bahamas, Guatemala, Mexico. In terms of our current account balance, we are better than all those countries, better than the Dominican Republic, better than Jamaica. We're above the line, they're below the line. In terms of our fiscal deficit, there are only a few countries that are better than us. And in the case of Jamaica, they are in an IMF program where they have no choice but to run a fiscal surplus. They are mandated by the IMF to run a fiscal surplus in the vicinity of 1% or so, somewhere between 0 and 1. And the way they do that, they retrench their public servants, they remove subsidies, they make people pay the full price for everything. That's how they achieve a fiscal surplus. We in Trinidad and Tobago don't do that. But still, our fiscal deficit is still better than all of these countries on the side here. Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Barbados, the Bahamas. I'd also like you to take a look at this slide. This gives an indication of the pressure on the economy. And the further to the right you are, and the lower you are, the less pressure there is on your economy. Again, we're better than all these countries over here. Argentina, Dominican Republic, Brazil, Costa Rica, Barbados, all highly stressed economies, highly stressed. Trinidad and Tobago, because of the recovery, is going into a situation of low pressure in terms of our finances. The next slide gives you some indication of inflation. Now, our lower inflation, if you look on the right-hand side, this is the market consensus as to where inflation should be. Right now, our inflation should be somewhere in the vicinity of 8%. But our inflation is just below 5%. Why? One of the main reasons is that we have not interfered with our exchange rate. That's one of the main reasons. As Dr. Siratan pointed out, if we had a sliding exchange rate and COVID hit us, where would the dollar be now? Might be 30 to 1. Who knows? But because we are managing our exchange rate and we have refused to devalue our dollar, this is why we've been able to keep inflation down in the 4% and 5%. United States is 9%, Europe is 9%. In terms of our credit rating, you'll have heard recently that Standard & Poor's has upgraded our outlook from negative to stable and maintained us in the investment grade. And the chart below, well, we'll see. We are going to be meeting with Moody's in November, but based on what Moody's is publishing, I don't want to talk too soon, it seems that we may get an improvement from Moody's. Now, I've told you all the good news. Our credit rating is improving, our revenue is increasing, our economy is in a growth mode, inflation is being kept at bay, the fiscal accounts are almost in balance, but I want you to see things like this. This is what we as a government have to be very, very careful about. This shows you the amount of money spent by the government on the fuel subsidy between October of 2021 and September of 2022. I want you to look particularly at March. That is when oil prices hit their highest, when oil price went up to $130 and so on. Look at what the government of Trinidad and Tobago had to pay in fuel subsidy in 1 month, $309 million. Look at May, $310 million. June, $341 million. We are going to end this year with the government having to have spent $2.6 billion on fuel subsidy in the last 12 months. We had planned, when we did the increase in prices of fuel, we expected a subsidy maybe $800–900 million. It's $2.6 billion because oil prices have stayed up. Nobody ever expected oil prices to remain at that level, 105, 110, 120, that sort of thing. And if you look at the right-hand side, if oil prices remain where they are, in the $95 to $100 range, the subsidy next year will be $2.1 billion. I don't think we as a country can afford that. We have to, as the Prime Minister has indicated, we have to set a limit on the amount of subsidy that we can pay, and the rest of it will be used for other purposes, more desirable, more productive purposes. Please also look at this slide. There's been quite a lot of talk in the papers about a particular trade union that has accepted the government's offer of 4%. Offer of 4% over the period 2014 to 2019, a 6-year period, for the mainstream public service is going to cost the government, that's the offer on the table, it's going to cost $2.43 billion in back pay. That's up to June 23. The additional annual recurrent cost will be $490 million per year. That's going to increase the public sector wage bill by $490 million. And that's just the mainstream public service. It doesn't include statutory authorities and state enterprises. If the offer is extended to the wider state sector, which is inevitable, the cost will almost double to $4.66 billion in back pay. And the annual additional cost will be almost $1 billion that will be added to our wage bill. Now, this is something we as a government have agonized over for a very long time. This is not small money we're talking about here. Have agonized over for a very long time. This is not small money we're talking about here. We're talking about increasing the annual recurrent cost of wages by $1 billion per year. We're talking about back pay of $4.6 billion. But as difficult as it will be to find the money for this, the government is committed to raising these funds and making these payments. But I've put an example as to what one of the major trade unions is asking for. The PSA has asked for a 19% increase for the first 3 years, 2014 to 2016. That would cost $15.8 billion in back pay. The additional annual cost would be $1.8 billion per year. And if you extend that to the state sector, that would cost $30.3 billion in back pay. And $3.4 billion would be added to the annual public sector wage bill. I put here, this level of expenditure is simply not possible. It's not practical. It's not feasible. It's just not possible. And these numbers need to be understood. If the government were to accept the proposals being made by the major trade unions, we would have to find $30 billion in back pay just for the first 3 years, not even the second one, because the offer that is on the table is for 2014 to 2016 and 2017 to 2019. That's the 4%. 2% in the first 3 years, 2% in the second 3 years. That's going to cost us $4.6 billion. But the unions are asking for something that would cost $30 billion for the first 3 years. God alone knows what it will cost for the second 3 years. It might cost $50 billion. So these requests are just unrealistic and unsustainable. I want you to look at the structure of the economy as well, the structure of expenditure. This chart tells you the percentage of expenditure that is spent on transfers and subsidies. 50%. The red line, if you look at 2020 expenditure, for example, 2019 expenditure, the red bar is transfers and subsidies. Now, transfers and subsidies are made up, at least 50% of transfers and subsidies, or a little less than 50%, is pensions. We are one of the few countries in the world that provide a senior citizen's pension that is non-contributory. In the United States, you have Social Security, but you have to contribute. We have a government pension, non-contributory. Again, most countries in the world, government workers contribute to their pension. We have inherited that as a colonial legacy, and no adjustments were ever made to that. So you have a situation now where pensions, government pension, senior citizens pension, cost $10 billion a year. $10 billion a year. The other elements of transfers and subsidies, you will see on another slide in a short while. We subsidize WASA to the tune of $2 billion a year. We pay out $5 billion in social grants every year. And that brings me to my next slide. Look at this. That is what your money is being spent on. Over $5 billion a year on social grants. Over $2 billion a year subsidizing WASA. Fuel subsidy, over $2 billion in 2022. Electricity costs us $700 million a year in subsidy. And you might ask, why? How does electricity cost us $700 million a year? The reason is that TNTech is supplied with natural gas from NGC, which has to buy that gas from BP and Shell and so on. TNTech doesn't pay NGC for the gas. So NGC has a receivable on its books that grows every year. The last time I looked at it, the receivable was $7 billion. 10 years of payments not made. So these are things that we have as a country we have to talk about. Should we be subsidizing WASA $2 billion a year? We've already indicated that we think an appropriate cap for the fuel subsidy is $1 billion. We shouldn't be subsidizing electricity to that extent, $700 million a year. And of course, social grants, we are committed to that. That is part of our policy, and that is part of taking care of those who are least able to take care of themselves. So going forward, we expect to have a primary surplus by 2023 and an overall surplus by 2024. We have to be responsible, though. We have to implement reforms to diversify the economy. We have to keep our eye on our forex regime, and we have to resist calls for interference with our exchange rate. We can't lower our guard. As the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank has pointed out, that with such an unusual degree of uncertainty in the world economy and with extreme volatility in commodity prices, and the prices will come down. They will. They may not go below $90, but they will come down. I can't see oil remaining up in that $110, $120 range for too much longer. So we have to emerge from this current crisis stronger, because the resilience of the Trinidad and Tobago economy is what allowed us to survive COVID. And the message I want to give today, if you look at the data, and you'll hear more about this in the budget, because of the support that we gave to the population and to the business community when COVID hit, because we dipped into our buffers, our Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and we accessed loan funding both internationally and locally, and we kept the economic momentum going. That is what has caused the economy to recover. If I digress, I went to the Agri Expo, and I was very impressed. But I was also very surprised at the number of small businesses that have taken up the challenge, have recovered, and are growing in this 2022. And when I talked to the banks, a number of banks had provisioned for bad debts in 2020 and 2021 because they expected businesses to fail. They are now reducing their provisioning because businesses are not failing as expected. Businesses are growing. Revenue is improving. People are paying their debts. So that as we move forward, we have to be very careful about what we are doing. I've shown you some very good news, some very positive news, but we can't lower our guard. So I will end my presentation by telling you that, as the PS has said, things are a little better now. I looked at the overdraft yesterday, it was 39%. I looked at the overdraft last month, it was 20%. I haven't seen a 20% overdraft. I'm talking about the government's overdraft at the central bank. In the 7 years that I've been in finance, I had never seen the overdraft reach a level of 20%. In other words, we had 80% of our overdraft available to us. When we came in September 2015, I still vividly remember the then governor of the central bank telling me that we have to go and raise some funds by way of borrowing, otherwise he would turn off the tap. And I asked him what he meant by that. He said, you have enough money to run the country for 3 days. 3 days. Overdraft is at about 97%. And we have gone through the 2015, 2016, 2017, as Ms. Leachy pointed out, managing cash flow very, very carefully. There were many times between 2016 and 2018 where we had to rush to the local banking sector and borrow $1 billion or $2 billion. Otherwise, we would not have been able to pay salaries. It was as bad as that. Sometimes we had to tell the central bank, just ease up a little bit. Sometimes we went over the overdraft by 1% in that 2016 to 2018 period. It wasn't easy, but we managed it, and we paid salaries on time for all of those difficult years. We met our commitments. We paid our debt service. We defaulted on nothing. So now when I see the overdraft is 20%, 25%, 38%, as Ms. Leachy says, we are in a position where we can safely honor any request for funds from any ministry that comes in. We have enough money. I've never experienced that before. But I want to end by saying we have to be careful. This is not the time to let go. This is not the time to throw away the good work of the last 7 years, because as the Deputy Governor pointed out, you never know what's going to happen next month. Oil might drop to $75. Gas might drop to $3. The war in Ukraine might come to an end. Putin might make peace with Zelensky. You don't know. In this world, you just don't know. So we can't bank on $100 oil, and we can't bank on $9 gas going forward. We have to be prudent, and we have to be careful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister of Finance, the Honorable Colm Imbert. And that concludes our presentation segment of today's proceedings. We shall now take a short break, and we'll be back for the panel Q&A session at 11:45.
Change your fate. Start to win at life with $20,000 every month. Win $20,000 every month for 20 years with NLCB's newest game, Win for Life. 6 numbers from 28 plus the cash ball could make you win for life. You deserve a win. Play Win for Life today. Visit NLCBGames.com for details. Players must be 18 years and over. Please play responsibly.
Welcome to this morning's Playway, Pick 2 and Pick 4 draw, supervised by independent auditors KPMG and presided over by the National Lotteries Control Board. Good luck, everyone.
Good morning. Welcome to NLCB's Playway, Pick 2 and Pick 4 draw for Friday, September 2nd, 2022. First to draw this morning's Playway number. Winning number, it's 10. Lucky mark, it's Monkey. That's number 10. Our Mega Mix machine is loaded with a Mega Bonus Ball in each chamber. Should a Mega Bonus Ball call, you win $36. If a Mega Ball calls, $80. A Mega Ultra Ball calls, $100. And $125 should a Mega Extreme Ball call. Players' Mega Options cost an additional $1, and you can win more Mega for your money. Now for our Mega Mix selection. Players play remark number 10, Monkey, is scored along with 3 white balls. Keep on playing. You've won the base payout of $26. For every $1 played, Mega Options cost an additional $1 minimum. And now we draw this morning's Pick 2 numbers. First pick 2 number, it is 25. Number again, 25. Now for the second pick 2 number. Second pick 2 number, it is 31. Our pick 2 numbers are 25 and 31 in that order. And now for pick 2 Mega to the Max promotion. If the white ball calls, there'll be no extra payout. However, when the pick 2 Mega Ball calls, players who wager on the Mega Ball win the base prize of $2,000 plus an increased Mega prize of $6,000 if they match 2 numbers in the correct order. And we have a Mega Ball. Congratulations to our Pick 2 Mega to the Max winners. Pick 2 numbers 25 and 31 have called in that order with a Mega Ball. Not only have you won your base payout, but an additional Mega prize. And now for this morning's Pick 4 numbers. First number, it is 2. Second, it's 1. Third, it is 1. And the fourth, also 1. This morning's winning pick for numbers are 2, 1, 1, and 1 in that order. Congratulations to our Playway Pick 2 and Pick 4 winners. And players, you deserve to win for life. Get your tickets for this evening's Win for Life draw, where you can win $20,000 every month for 20 years. And now for some Cashpot news. 12 lucky players who chose yesterday's 5 winning numbers, each won $14,694. Congratulations to those fortunate Cashpot winners. Thank you for joining us. Do so again at 1 o'clock this afternoon for another Playway Pick 2 and Pick 4 draw.
This is TTT. Live for local.
This song is a tribute to all of the beautiful people of Trinidad and Tobago, from the great mother Ella Ander. A wind of destruction is blowing over this land. And now the earth is a trembling with man's oppression of man. Now the time comes to sit down and rediscover what's life. Show the world the true meaning of real love, power, not strife. Bring down the power. Bring down the power of love, I say. The power of love, I say. Oh Lord, stop hell and damnation. Bring down the power. Love to heal a nation is the greatest power. Oh Lord. Put a hand on the fire and cleanse the wicked. Right now. Right now. All of them who does worship greed and vanity must bow. Bring down the power. Unity is the banner, so come together. I say. And this love is for freedom, it's growing stronger each day. Bring down the power. Bring down the power of love, I say. The power of love, I say. Oh Lord, stop hell and damnation. Bring down the power. Love to heal a nation is the greatest power. Oh Lord, yeah, yeah. So rejoice in a rhythm of celebration. Come on. Lift your voice with a feeling of satisfaction as one. Bring down the power. And let me move with a purpose, all freedom lovers. Hold tight. Hold tight. Stepping out of the darkness with one direction in sight. to heal a nation.
The winning numbers in the National Lottery online draws for Friday, 2nd September 2022 at 10:30 a.m. Playway, the number 10 Monkey. Pick 2 numbers 25 and 31 in that order. Mega Ball called. Pick 4 numbers 2, 1, 1 and 1 in that order.
My country.
1962, such a significant year in our country's history. Trinidad and Tobago, we got the coat of arms, we got the national flag, and we got the national anthem. The national anthem shows our diversity as a people and for us coming together as one no matter our differences. Today I'm on the case in Arima to find out what do you know about the national anthem. There you go.
As only Trinbagonians will understand. I love my country. I love my land.
Who wrote the national anthem?
Patrick Castani.
You sure what I want?
Certain.
I really don't think I could remember that today.
Tell him there. True or false? Is it okay to change the speed and tone of the national anthem?
False.
No, it's true. It's okay to do that. Okay, Jacqueline. True or false? Is it law for you to stand for the national anthem?
True.
Yes.
No, it's not law. It's protocol. Was the Trinidad and Tobago national anthem originally written for Trinidad and Tobago?
I should think so.
No.
You're correct. It was written for the West Indian Federation, which never come to pass, but you take that one. How many times does Trinidad and Tobago appear in the national anthem?
Once?
Sure what?
No.
No.
I don't know.
Come on, quick guess.
About 10 times?
No, 0 times.
Every day you learn something new.
Niceness, I like your spirit. I sing a line, you sing next line full, right? Forge from the love of liberty,
In the fires of hope and prayer.
with boundless faith in our destiny.
We solemnly declare.
Side by side we stand.
Island of the
Blue Caribbean Sea.
This our native land.
We pledge our lives to thee.
Hear every creed and race, find an equal place, and may God bless our nation.
Every creed and race find an equal place.
And may God bless our nation.
And that's it. Today we found those of you who knew a thing or two about the national anthem, and to the others, give you a little history lesson. So next time you hear the national anthem, stand tall, stand proud, because those words represent you as a Trinbagonian. I'm Carlos, and today in Arima, I was on the case.
Hi, I'm Penny Gomez, and welcome to Pop. This is Worship the Mayor of San Fernando, Alderman Junior Regrello. Welcome to Pop. I'm in South.
And we went off to Germany with a plain load of performers.
And we mash up.
And this is a stretch demo.
It's Janine Rand, Miss World.
When I started this journey, I could not walk in heels.
We're doing good. We're going to do good, you know.
Ups up once, and you gotta be careful. Anything more than that, different.
That's what you call a hot cocktail. Introducing the queen herself. I have to fling my cape.
Look like a Powerpuff Girl.
And it is
a Fraggle Rock kind of something. The extempo, no, I could whine. Yeah, that's our next episode. I come here to fling bam bam. Woo. Fling fling bam bam. I come here to fling bam bam. That is my new release. Fling fling bam.
We are going beyond the headlines, asking the questions you want answered. Joining us this week, the Honorable Marvin Gonzalez, Minister of Public Utilities, and Mr. Ravi Nanga, Chairman of the Water and Sewage Authority. Join us this Sunday at 7 p.m. on TTT, TTT Live Online, and the Talk City 91.1 FM. We are delving deeper.
Falling our best line and give thanks for life. Yeah.
Yes, we celebrating, we're doing it nice. We right here at the Buku Boardwalk. Well, you remember we turning 60, right? Yes, boy, Trinidad and Tobago, we turning 60, we celebrating. And on Sunday, the 28th of August, we coming right back here at the Boardwalk as we light up the Boardwalk and we partying for Sunday school. And don't worry, we still have more on Friday, 2nd of September. We're doing it again. We're coming down for the Friday Lime. Yes, so make it a date, don't be late, because after the Friday Lime, the luncheon, we have more coming up again. 6 p.m. Head back down to Buku. We liming, we having our time.
Yeah, and we go down like kitty killy, kitty killy, kitty killy, kitty killy, kitty killy. Come and we jam like kitty killy, kitty killy, kitty killy. That's the vibe, yeah.
Oh, hi there. Welcome. Welcome to my shop. This is Jones Repair Shop, and I'm Mr. Jones. In my shop, there's nothing that cannot be fixed. The number one thing that I like to fix are hearts. Can you think about somebody who has heart in your life? Wow, your parents. They have an inner strength, right? So has heart, everyone, means to have an inner strength.
We are going beyond the headlines, asking the questions you want answered. Joining us this week, the Honorable Marvin Gonzalez, Minister of Public Utilities, and Mr. Ravi Nanga, Chairman of the Water and Sewage Authority. Join us this Sunday at 7 p.m. on TTT, TTT Live Online, and the Talk City 91.1 FM. We are delving deeper.
Hey, we outside with we family, boy, yes. And on the 3rd of September, we're still celebrating independence. 60 years of independence right here in Trinidad and Tobago. It's all about red, white, and black, the walkathon and breakfast. And we're starting right here at the Dwight York Stadium. Yes, and then we're going straight into Scarborough. Yes, we building our sweat, boy. We're coming through the streets of Scarborough, right? We in Fred Hudson. And after we leave Scarborough, you know where we headed next? Down to the Shaw Park complex. So yes, remember we're celebrating it and we're ending it off with the walkathon. Trinidad and Tobago, happy independence. We turning 60. Yes, boy.
Everybody, drop it up together. Drop it up together. Family, where you there? Boom.
And that's it there for the show. We would like to stay, but we got to go. You don't know. Yes, Olia. Later. Oh, right. People, parents, your dreams have come true. This is your boy Tintin here talking to you, letting you know that we will be having walk-in auditions for 12 and under. You understand? Saturday, the 10th of September, we will be at TTT, right here at 11A Marval Road. You can just walk in with your talented young one and get that audition done. And then on the 11th, we are going to be at Harris Promenade in San Fernando. You don't know. Come and get your audition and bring your talented young one on our show. It's all about 12 and under. It's coming back to you. Your boy Timmons. I'm going to be one of your co-hosts, and I just want to see all my talented children out there. Yeah. That's what we're talking about. 12 and under, it's coming. Oh!
Hi, I'm Penny Gomez, and welcome to Pop. This is Worship the Mayor of San Fernando, Alderman Junior Regrello. Welcome to Pop. I'm inside.
And we went up to Germany with a plain load of performers.
And we mash up.
And this is stretch the demo.
Ooh, it's Janine Rand, Miss World.
When I started this journey, I could not walk in heels.
We're doing good. We're going to do good, you know.
Cups are punching. You gotta be careful. Anything more than that, different.
That's what you call a hot cocktail. Introducing the queen herself. I have to fling my cane.
Look like a Powerpuff Girl.
And it's
a Fraggle Rock kind of something. Next tempo, no, I could whine. Yeah, that's the next episode. I come here to fling bam bam. Woo. Fling fling bam bam. I come here to fling bam bam. That is my new release. Fling fling bam.
I think we should do that. I think. Everyone, we're about to resume. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We are about to begin the panel segment of today's proceedings, where we will take questions from the audience and also from the online community, which is the national community. I would like you, when you pose your question, please let us know exactly who you are posing the question to on our panel, and I'm sure and who you are as well, thank you. And I'm sure that our panelists will answer to the best of their ability. Let's see who is going first. The mics are right here across from the camera bay. Here we go.
Jules Brown, TV6 News. Just a couple of points, questions to the Finance Minister. The Prime Minister had announced very recently that there would be a separate special payment for those in the public health sector in terms of their role on the front lines in terms of the fight against COVID-19. Have you been able to identify total in terms of that payment and how that will be financed? That's my first question.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we have identified the cost. I was in touch with the Minister of Health just a few days ago. It's going to cost us $200 million, and we will find the money for that. As the Prime Minister indicated, that sector needs to be recognized and appreciated and rewarded for steering the country through the COVID-19 crisis. $200 million.
Thank you, sir. My other question, if there continues to be delays in terms of the government via the CPO and the trade unions representing public sector workers, public servants, in terms of issues such as back pay and so on, and salary increases, how much more difficult a challenge would that be for Trinidad and Tobago going forward in terms of expenditure?
I put up a slide which indicated that the cost of the 4% that is on the table for the mainstream public service is almost $2.5 billion in back pay and $500 million in additional annual recurrent expenditure on wages and salaries. And if that is extended to the wider public sector, the statutory authorities, state enterprises, it almost doubles. The back pay goes up to over $4.5 billion, and the annual additional recurrent cost of wages and salaries goes up by $1 billion, which increases our wage bill in the public sector by 10%. That is the offer the government has put on the table. And the CPO has written to the unions some weeks ago indicating that that was the government's final offer.
I just want to point out something there, Joel, now that the Minister of Finance has said that. Remember the marker that we're working with in terms of the additional revenues of $8.2 billion. It means that half of that $8.2 billion is committed to public servants and the wider public service in the way that the Minister of Finance has just mentioned. Bearing in mind that we have already spent from that $8 billion, $2.6 billion in the mid-year review on the wider population. And also finally bear in mind that over and above what is spent on public servants, the rest that is spent on public servants also is spent on public servants. Right?
Thank you.
When you spend on the wider national community, they benefit there too. And then you specifically spend towards their pay packet. So public servants, based on what we are getting, what is on offer, they are the best served in the country at this time with these decisions.
Thank you. What I'm going to do here now is mix in one of our online questions. And this one is directed to the Minister of Finance. Can the Minister of Finance advise how far along is the RIC rate review process for WASA and TNTech?
Well, I'm not the line minister for the Regulated Industries Commission, but I have some information based on what the Minister of Public Utilities has told us. We are looking at completion of this exercise in the first part of 2023. That's all I can say from my perspective at this point in time, not being the line minister for the RIC, but that's the information given to the cabinet by the Minister of Public Utilities. We're looking at the first half of 2023. The RIC will complete the exercise and publish its findings and its determination of the rates for water and electricity.
Next, we'll take another in-house question.
Good afternoon to all. Letitia Tallisford, representing the Central Finance Facility. So, inequitable wealth distribution, and actually more importantly, opportunities for wealth creation plague us as a nation, and hence the over $5 billion in social grants annually. And the cooperative system was created to address challenges like this. Can we then, Honorable Minister, look forward to any initiatives by government to partner with the cooperative movement to address these challenges in the 2022-2023 budget? Honorable Minister of Finance, we are still waiting on the SMEs facility to materialize as was proposed and promised to us, as well as a number of other proposals, one dealing with food security and another in engaging with unemployed youth. So asking from the cooperative sector, credit union movement, are we able then to look forward to something in this budget coming up? Thank you.
The commitments we made to the credit union sector remain. We have been a bit surprised at the level of the government at the very low uptake by the credit union sector of the incentives and the programs that we offered the sector. Very, very low uptake. It seems that approaches were made to the government with respect to loan programs, subsidized loans, and so on, and there has not been the corresponding response from the sector. But those programs are approved, and those programs will continue, and we'll have to work with the sector to find out what is causing the delay on your side in terms of taking advantage of these programs.
So, if I may, I do agree with you. There was low uptake on the individual basis, and that low uptake would have been reflected as well in the commercial sector. But what we're specifically interested in is dealing with SME funding for the business sector. Thanks.
In terms of the COVID-19 SME relief program, that has gone quite well. We changed the criteria recently. We increased the level of government guarantee, we reduced the requirements, and the banks are reporting that far more businesses now are taking advantage of the SME guaranteed loan program. One of the fundamental things we did, and there was quite a lot of argument about this, is that we gave businesses a 2-year grace period to be up to date with their statutory payments in terms of taxes, in terms of NIS payments, and so on. We gave them a grace period as well in terms of being up to date with their audited accounts. We also increased the level of guarantee from the government. We recognize that we had to do this because we have a growing SME sector, and therefore we have to help them. The Cabinet also approved another SME guarantee loan program, which is very close to finalization. That is a long-term program that we expect to run for the next 5 to 10 years, where the government again will guarantee loans to small and medium enterprises up to 85% of the loan amount. So look out for that. That is going to be coming soon. I meet with the central bank on this on a regular basis. I expect within the next couple of weeks that will all be resolved, and the new SME guarantee loan program, which actually has a fund of $500 million, will be available for small and medium enterprises.
I'll take another online question at this point in time. This one comes from Brian Chambers. Does the government measure productivity in the public sector?
Who is that posed to?
I think it's you.
Me? We most certainly do. And it's something that has to be improved. It's a very intractable issue. All governments have had to deal with this, productivity in the public sector. And speaking for myself now, one of the problems that COVID has presented us with is a lot of people got accustomed to staying home, working from home. And we have to encourage people to get back into the system and get back into the physical workplace.
We'll take another in-house question at this point in time.
Hi, Minister. I have two questions for you. The first one is that you...
Excuse me,
Curtis
could you
Williams
identify
from
yourself,
the
please?
Curtis Williams from the Guardian.
Thank you.
Yeah, you've been consistently wrong over the last 7 years on the production figures, including this year. This year, you talked about 3.2 BCF a day. It's about 2.5 according to the Ministry of Energy. You talk about crude production at 70,000 barrels. It's about 59,000 on average. What gives you confidence that your projection of higher crude production and gas production going forward will in fact come through when you've been consistently wrong in the last 7 years? And the second question has to do with respect to the fuel subsidy. If, as the EIA, which you've used in your budget in the past, prediction comes true, which is about $92 to $95 a barrel next year, do you expect then that consumers at the pump are going to have to pay higher prices for petrol?
Okay, dealing with the first question, Mr. Williams, the figures quoted in the annual budget are not generated by the Ministry of Finance. I'm sure you know that. The production figures for oil and gas are presented to us by the Ministry of Energy. So I don't understand your point about being consistently wrong. We get the information from the Ministry of Energy. I have every confidence in the Ministry of Energy under its current leadership that the information we receive that will be used for the budget going forward will be as accurate as possible under the circumstances. With respect to the subsidy, the Prime Minister has already indicated that the government is contemplating putting a cap on the level of the subsidy at somewhere in the vicinity of $1 billion. That is a policy decision announced by the Prime Minister. That will be a policy decision of the government going forward. We will see how that plays out in terms of prices. Right now, we're looking at a subsidy of $2 billion. We have decided to put a cap on the subsidy of $1 billion, and therefore the consequence of that will be inevitable.
Let me just say something here based on where this posture is going. The people of Trinidad and Tobago, by this gathering and others, are to be encouraged to understand that the heavily subsidized fuel consumption is not the best response to the changed circumstances. There are Caribbean territories where fuel subsidy is not a feature at all. So to encourage people to believe that it doesn't matter what is happening anywhere in the world or anywhere in the business, local or foreign, that subsidized fuel with no attempt to respond by either reducing the consumption, being more efficient, being concerned about the price of fuel is not a serious encouragement. What we are trying to do is to make the most of the resources we have available. And as I said earlier on, if one looks back historically, and you see, as you will see, that we have spent $30-odd billion on fuel subsidy, you can only ask yourself a question. Had that policy not been so, what could we have better done in developing this country with some of that $35 billion? And now that we have all these demands on the limited revenue, do we then still encourage, not just have it happen, but encourage a situation where an entitlement of cheap fuel is in fact the best way to handle the limited resources? So we've indicated that the government will carry some of the burden, but we expect the population to be cognizant that there's an increase that they could influence in some way as well. So we're not surprised to hear that you're asking what is going to happen if the price remains high. We also feel that the price may not remain high permanently. And if the price falls below a certain level, we expect to reflect that in the downward pressure on the price as well.
Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister. I believe economists around the world are unified in their thinking in terms of the inefficiency of fuel subsidies. I believe the Minister of Finance just answered the online question, so we'll take another in-house question.
Hello, good afternoon. Fazil Khan, Joint Counsel for the Construction Industry. This question is for the Prime Minister. Honorable Prime Minister, I think we are all on the same page to understand that procurement reform will save this country or has the potential to save this country billions of dollars. What is the latest date that you now have for the full proclamation and operationalization, please?
The premise of your argument there is a little questionable there. I am not agreeing with what you're saying there. I was talking to the Prime Minister of Jamaica a few days ago, and we talked at length on this whole question of the procurement legislation that they have implemented, and they are well ahead of us by a few years of implementing the procurement legislation very much along the lines that we are going. And the thing that surprised me in his answers to me is that there are two levels of response to the procurement legislation in practice in Jamaica. One, at the upper level with larger contracts, it seemed to be working relatively smoothly and beneficially. At the lower level, where there are massive medium and small contracts, two things have come out of it. One is increased costs and increased delays. So I just give you that for coming from a Prime Minister who's practicing it. The other thing is that since last March, when I was absolutely convinced that we could have done the full proclamation by March, because the Minister of Finance will tell you I have been pushing to have the full proclamation done. And we are delayed by some cautionary involvements. I would hope that we can get that out of the way so that in the not too distant future, without giving you a date, that we can be able to proclaim the legislation. It appears as though there's going to be some, the main problem in front of us now is some lack of preparation in mainly local government and some cautionary tales from I shouldn't use the word tales, some cautionary words from the judiciary, which I think we are going to take on board. And hopefully in some time in the very near future, we'll proclaim it and try and work through the tangles. But waiting for the perfect day and the perfect state and being accused that we are somehow benefiting by not having it is not my posture at all. I would like to have it done, but it requires a little more preparation. And I understand also from my last inquiry that the office of the director also has some minor adjustments to be made or something like that. So let's just try and get it done as quickly as possible. And I just want to say that this piece of legislation holds out some promise for improvements, but it's not a panacea. It is not a panacea. But we want to get it done, and we'll try to work it. And it would not be the first time that an imperfect piece of legislation has been proclaimed, and you either work it and amend it. But the public service is so involved in its operationalization that if you are cautioned that the public service is not in a position to do it, then one just has to be a little cautious, and that's where we are. But we are committed to doing it as quickly as possible.
Thank you. We'll take an online question here from Clark Kenrick. The Prime Minister would have acknowledged the need to repair our roads. Should we expect a significant allocation for road repairs and restoration in the upcoming budget? I assume this is for Minister Imbert.
Well, you've heard the Prime Minister speak about this. I think that question has already been answered. The Prime Minister made the point at a recent event that the focus during the pandemic was on saving lives. Now that we have broken the back of the health crisis, now that the economy is recovering, certainly there will be a substantial allocation in the budget towards road repair and rehabilitation. The PM would have also mentioned the establishment of a new company specifically designed to deal with local roads, neighborhood roads, secondary roads, and so on. It's called the Secondary Roads Company. It's been assigned to the Ministry of Local Government. In fact, in this year's budget, we have an appropriation of $100 million for that company. There'll be substantially more in the 2023 budget going forward for that specific purpose, because I think we all recognize that while we were focusing on rescuing the economy and making sure the population was safe, there were some things that could not have received the attention that perhaps they should have. But going forward, there'll be a significant focus on road repair and rehabilitation, and in particular, the funding of those activities.
Thank you. We will take another in-house question. Anyone else? I think I'll pose a question to the Minister of Finance, and it's one about retirement age, dealing with the NIB. Any information you'd like to share with the national community?
Well, Brian, you're not supposed to ask questions, eh? But I'll answer it. Those of you who may not know, Minister Manning has been meeting with all of the labor unions and also private sector entities. I think the meetings are completed, and giving the government's perspective on increasing the retirement age. Now, the purpose of increasing the retirement age, the concept is quite rational. If you increase the retirement age, people can work for longer in perhaps some of the more productive years of their lives, but they also will get their full salary during that particular period if you increase the retirement age, for example, to age 65. It allows persons who are in employment, optionally, it's optional, to work for 5 more years at full salary and then take their pension. It allows far greater contributions to all of our pension funds, particularly the National Insurance Fund. So that having finished those consultations, I think we got complete agreement from the private sector.
Yes, from the private sector.
And we got agreement from the trade unions behind closed doors, and disagreement in the public. But we are quite satisfied that this is the way forward, and we will be making a proposal to Cabinet. Of course, it's a Cabinet decision. As any ministry, we will have to justify it. But we do believe we can make a solid presentation to the Cabinet for incorporation to look at increasing the retirement age. Trinidad and Tobago is way behind the rest of the world in this regard. Barbados, for example, I'm told the retirement age is 66 or 67. And in North America, I believe it's close to 70. In England, I'm told there's no retirement age. I was quite shocked to learn that recently, that there is no retirement age in the UK. The laws have been changed to the point where you can continue working as long as you are able to be productive. So we are way behind the rest of the world in all of this. But the most important and most significant benefit from an increase in the retirement age is to ensure the stability, integrity, and long-term survival of our national insurance pension arrangements. That is absolutely essential, but it will also help a myriad of other pension funds.
We'll take another in-house question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Akash Samaru here from Guardian Media. Minister, can you give us an update on property tax? You mentioned previously implementation before the end of this year. Where are we with that? Is that still the plan? And to what extent will the property tax help government's revenue position? That's question 1. And 2, can we continue to pay $10 billion in grants for senior citizens in an aging society? If not, when do we start the pension reform process?
You have to understand that senior citizens are part of a non-contributory pension plan. Non-contributory. So to say that you're going to reform a system like that, I think you've started off based on a false premise. There's no intention to reform senior citizens' pension. It's something that we as a country have committed to do. We've been doing it for the last 50, 60 years, and it is something that we will continue to do and something that we have to do to take care of our elderly and those who are least able to take care of themselves. With respect to property tax, yes, we're on target. And the most important outcome of the collection of property tax will be increased funding and increased supply of funding to local government bodies. It's a feature of our politics that every week you would see a complaint coming from a local government body, particularly those in opposition, that they don't have sufficient money, that they're starved of funds for infrastructure work in particular. Repairs to roads, clearing of drains, work of that nature, important work in communities. They keep complaining about it. In the local government reform legislative agenda, in the law that has been passed, it has not yet been proclaimed, but the law that has been passed reserves all residential property tax for local government corporations for use within the corporation. It is estimated that the property tax, once properly collected for residential properties within the various regions, could yield upwards of $400 million. What that means is that on average, each corporation will get $30 million per year for infrastructure, for the things that they are always complaining about. They don't have funds for water trucking. They don't have funds to buy diesel for their equipment. They don't have funds to patch roads, to repair landslips. And it's a very important feature of the property taxation model that is going to be dedicated to those corporations and can be used by them to do all of the things that they now say they cannot do because they don't have the funds.
Next, we'll take an online question. We have another one here from Brian Chambers. Why is it that water usage metering is not progressing at a faster rate?
Tell them it costs more than the funeral.
Should the government not ensure that all new housing starts must include water metering, just as what is done for electricity?
Well, I'm not the Minister of Public Utilities, but I'll take the liberty to say that I think if you try to meter water and you're not getting water, all you'll do is get people vexed. So that I think the focus has to be on improving water supply. And as the Prime Minister was just mentioning to me, the candle might cost more than the funeral. The cost of water metering in this country is in the billions. All of the estimates that we have for installation of meters, especially residential meters, we're talking $2-3 billion. So that if you have $2 or $3 billion to spend on our water supply network, it is a far better idea to spend that money on improving pipelines, replacing old pipelines, installing new pumps, improving reservoirs, improving the supply of surface water, drilling new wells, and so on. So that meters sound nice. It's a nice sounding idea, but you can't meter something that you're not getting. And then one has to be very careful about just getting carried away with these things and wasting money on expenditure that does not yield any positive result.
We'll take another online question, this one coming from K. Baldeo Singh. While I agree with much of what Dr. Siratan said, I would like some clarification on which expenses have been cut to a minimum. What about being more efficient, cutting wastage, reducing public funds lost illegally, and spending more wisely? Maybe we can have Dr. Siratan speak on this one.
Well, I happen to know Ms. Baldev Singh. I suppose that's why she's asking me the question. I think some time ago the minister had a discussion about expenditure efficiency, and you did reference it as well in terms of your discussion about the efficiency of the public service. There's actually a lot of different ways you can actually benchmark the performance of the public sector in terms of the kinds of output they get. So, for example, in In transport, you could measure the amount of kilometers of secondary and primary roads that you build and benchmark that relative to other countries and use that as a basis for deciding how much money is allocated every year to a particular ministry and so on. This is a relatively simple example, but I've done some work on expenditure efficiency. And the area that is most in need of increased efficiency is in the area of PSIP and expenditure. And the ironical thing is, the more money you have, the less efficient you tend to be, and that is irrespective of the part of the world that you're in. That when you have a lot of money, you tend to be less prudent in terms of how it's spent and so on. But the short answer to Ms. Baldo's question is that there are many different ways in which the government could actually do performance budgeting, and a lot of it involves collecting information on various functional areas and so on. And that is probably something that the minister could focus on sometime in the future. I know we do some of it already because the IMF together with the World Bank have been going around training people in the various ministries of finance and so on around the region on performance budgeting, which deals with some aspect of that performance measurement and so on. So the short answer is yes, we are doing some things, but obviously we could be much better at it.
Very interesting.
Let me come in here.
Sure.
I think I need to emphasize the fact that when we came in 2015, we met an expenditure profile of $60 billion, which we reduced to 50. And we maintained our expenditure profile at $50 billion for many years. Now, how is it possible to reduce your government expenditure from $60 billion to $50 billion and still maintain all your services and still pay public servants salaries on time every month? What that tells you is that where we reduced expenditure was waste, and then in a controversial area, corruption. Because what we found when we came in is that the prices of goods and services offered to the government, they were inflated. And if you look at expenditure patterns now of the government, particularly in big ticket items, in road construction and so on, the cost to the government now of the same services, construction of buildings, paving of roads, etc., is significantly less than it used to be. So that is an area where this government has somehow been able to reduce government expenditure by $10 billion, by 20%, and still maintain water, electricity, healthcare, deal with a pandemic, stabilize the economy, put the economy on a growth path. So
the development program.
So to put it simply, we cut out waste and corruption.
Next in-house question.
So thanks again for taking the question. 2 points I just would like to have clarified. One, how will the refinery or the government's plan to sell or lease the refinery feature in the upcoming budget? And also, given the Agri-Expo and Investment Forum, will there be an increase or a major increase in allocations given to agriculture?
In terms of the refinery, I'd prefer not to say anything at this point in time. That matter is being dealt with by Trinidad Petroleum, and they are negotiating with a particular bidder at this point in time, so I wouldn't want to say any more.
Let me say something.
The Prime Minister wants
Let me say something on that, very simply. The refinery is not a budget item. And I want to repeat what has happened in Trinidad and Tobago. The state holding equity and operations in the hydrocarbon business was engaged in oil refining. And that's where the refinery came in, the refinery. Not Petrotrin, the refinery. The economics caused the state to come out of the refining business because we were not producing enough oil to make refining economically sound. We were importing upwards of 100,000, sometimes 120,000 barrels per day, and refining it and losing money in that process. So we came out of the refining business, and when we did that, we left behind a refinery without a supply of oil to be refined. So the refinery is not an item for the annual budget. What we said is that the refinery now not being operated by the state for the reasons just given. If there was anybody else or any other entity in the world who might have use for a refinery, we went out not once, not twice, but repeatedly to see if such persons or entity exist, and we were willing and still are willing to have them have the refinery and use it. So far, we have not been able to find a realistic operational arrangement for someone or some entity or some company to come in and use the equipment. So this is not a budget thing for the national budget for consideration in the budget. What was there in the beginning remains now, which is the state is no longer refining. We restructured the company, we're doing other things, and the equipment is there. And in the event that we find anyone interested, we are prepared to talk with them or come to an agreement. And the last time I checked, we were not the first country to have done that. There are a number of refineries around the world where the economics drove the operations like that to a conclusion in the processing of crude, and many of those refineries are still not being utilized. You may recall, Curacao used to be a major refining center in the region, Curacao and Aruba. And when they came out of refining, it has not been restarted up to this day. They were private sector refineries. The difference with Petrotrin here is that it is a state-owned refinery, and people keep looking to the state to do something different. But the economics are still the same, whether it's the private sector or the public sector.
And with respect to agriculture, of course, we have provided funding available to the Ministry of Agriculture in the amount of $800 million, additional to what they would normally get over the last couple of years. One of the issues in agriculture from where I sit in the Ministry of Finance is implementation. There's no issue in my view in terms of making funding available to the Ministry of Agriculture. What we need to work on is the ministry accessing that funding and implementing projects. But to answer your question, we have a major emphasis on providing all unnecessary funding for agriculture. And I mean, the appetite is there. I know very little about agriculture. But in going to the agricultural exposition, I want to say again, I was very impressed. Impressed at two things, not just the fact that the Ministry of Agriculture did a fantastic job, for which they must be commended, but the spirit, the intensity, the vibrancy, the eagerness of all those entrepreneurs that I saw in that Agri-Expo. Young entrepreneurs, young people making a variety of agricultural processed products. So the energy is there, and our challenge as a government is to harness that energy, and whatever funding is necessary will be made available.
Thank you. We'll take another online question at this point. No name attached, but apart from the fuel subsidy, are there any other subsidies the government is considering decreasing or removing?
We certainly not, and I want to re-emphasize the point. We certainly have no intention of doing anything with respect to pensions. I want to re-emphasize this government is committed to senior citizens' pensions. You will be aware that the Regulated Industries Commission is looking at rates for water and electricity. And I believe rate increases are inevitable, and that will reduce the amount of subsidies and transfers that are transferred to that particular sector. I think this is all well known in the public domain.
Thank you. I believe you have another in-house question.
You want to answer that one?
Yeah. A question just flashed across there about the National Statistical Institute. Only yesterday or the day before I was talking about that with our team. This is a sticking point for us. We have legislation going through the Parliament to establish this institute. The work has been done. Hoping that we can conclude the parliamentary process in the not too distant future. However, what came out of the discussion that I had a few days ago on it is that to implement this institute, which is sorely needed, it would require a special majority in the parliament. And this country knows its history with legislation that requires a special majority. I gave instructions 2 days ago that we will conclude the parliamentary exercise. We will bring it to the parliament requiring the special majority, and the parliamentarians elected by the population will determine whether we have a National Statistical Institute or not. It will come to the parliament for a vote as a special majority item.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, good day. My name is Marissa Asibedo, and I'm representing the Euro Chamber. Our concern is relating to the country's OECD non-compliant listing and the EU's blacklisting status. We acknowledge that the relevant bills have already been passed in Parliament, but now we need the BIR's full implementation. So our request to the Honourable Minister of Finance is that the necessary resources be provided to the BIR to ensure that we become compliant and we are removed from the blacklist in the shortest possible time. Thank you.
Okay. I thought it was a little more complicated than that. There are things that we have to do. We have changed from free zones to special economic zones. We've dealt with beneficial ownership in terms of companies. There's quite a bit of legislative work that is required to be implemented. But in terms of providing funding to the BIR, that is definitely going to happen. So you have no fear about funding being provided to the BIR in terms of making us compliant with the Global Forum and the EU. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. I don't think the problem is confined only to issues with the Board of Inland Revenue.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And it's more in light of the resources given to the BIR, because we understand that the peer review was delayed because of staff shortages. So it's more in that regard. But thank you for your comment.
I'm so glad you brought that up. One of the reasons why we are introducing a revenue authority is because, as I think it was Einstein that said, if you keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, that is the definition of insanity. We have tried the traditional public service approach to revenue collection for the last 60 years. It hasn't worked. And countries all over the world, progressive countries, have established semi-autonomous revenue authorities to give the government or these agencies the ability to recruit staff of the necessary competence, to do it in a speedy manner, to pay people compensation that they're entitled to. The problems that we face with the Board of Inland Revenue are throughout the system. It's the same problems that the Immigration Division faces, the same problems that any department of government faces. As part of our colonial legacy, a number of service commissions were established to insulate public servants from the politicians. It was a good idea then, but what has happened now, in retrospect, is that you are asking me to provide resources to the Board of Inland Revenue, and you're talking about human resources. You're talking about staff, and the government has no say whatsoever in the recruitment of staff in the traditional ministries. That is the purview of the Public Service Commission. And that's why we've moved to a revenue authority where a particular element of the revenue authority, enforcement, will be still within the purview of the Public Service Commission, but the other side of it, the administrative side, will be within the purview of a semi-autonomous revenue authority who can hire the right people, pay them the right amount of money, get the skill sets that they need to have a much more efficient revenue collection. There's always this belief that the government is responsible for hiring public servants, but we are not.
Yes. Move on, another question here online from K. Baldeo Singh. Minister Imbert said government has been able to meet its obligations and pay on time. What about school allocations?
I might have to ask Dr. Siratan to translate that for me. I'm not sure what that means. But if I just borrow what the Permanent Secretary said and what I said, we are quite satisfied that going forward, we're in a much better position financially, that the government will be able to meet all its obligations. A huge part of the government's budget, probably the largest part, right there with national security, is education. $6-7 billion a year is spent on education. So that I'm not sure what that question is aimed at, but certainly education will get the lion's share of the budget again, as per usual.
Do we have another in-house question? Okay, maybe we can have another online question. We just have a few more minutes left with this panel discussion. So I'll take the online question. What is the government's policy perspective on a residency by investment program themed on the US EB-5 program, which can attract foreign direct investment and create jobs for TNT nationals?
We're not there.
I'm afraid to answer that question. My immediate answer would be no. But I'll leave it over to the Prime Minister.
That is not on our front burner at this time.
Yes. Let's take another in-house question here.
Hi, Curtis Williams again from Guardian Media. Perhaps you could tell us to what extent is crime a downside risk to the economy going forward, and the second, and how government tends to reduce that risk. And the second question is also about, with respect to government expenditure. Do you expect increased expenditure next year?
The budget will be read on September the 26th, 2022, and I suggest, Mr. Williams, that you wait for the budget statement in terms of what will be in the next budget. Let me just repeat that. The budget will be read on Monday, the 26th of September, 2022.
On the question of crime with a downside, I think every citizen of this country and regionally would agree that our level of violent crime is in fact a downside of our activities and our circumstances. And therefore, whatever efforts are required to bring this to heel should have as its output a reduction in the risk of further escalation and more so the suppression of criminal conduct. It's a phenomenon of the time, and in our case in Trinidad and Tobago, the prevalence of firearms in the population and the use of firearms in committing violent crime is in fact a major issue for national focus, and we are doing that in a whole of government way, from the Ministry of Social Development, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You would have heard Prime Minister Holness saying that he found out as a Prime Minister in Jamaica that his major challenge is not managing a faltering economy, but managing a burgeoning crime rate in the society. And whatever we have to do to temper that, ameliorate it, and work towards the elimination, that is in fact a priority which should bring us benefit. But in the meantime, the downside is there, the risk is there, and we intend to keep focusing on it. It's not something that we don't expect to control it overnight, but we have to stay on the job and reduce violent crime and criminal conduct, focusing very heavily on the ease with which people can commit violence in our society with weapons even weapons of mass destruction.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to take one more question for our panel before we wrap up today's proceedings. I'd prefer to take an in-house question, but is there one available? I think I see someone approaching the mic here.
Afternoon, Letitia Taliswad, Central Finance Facility Cooperative Society of Trinidad and Tobago Limited, as well as the Mason Hall Credit Union. So there's a cabinet-appointed committee looking at the implementation of initiatives to strengthen the operations and supervision of the credit unions and cooperatives. In a time when the state is speaking of scarce resources available, and when the movement has over the past 20 years established credit union-financed institutions that have addressed areas of safety and soundness, such as deposit insurance and emergency liquidity support. Can the government please conserve expenditure by focusing on strengthening these existing organizations rather than discarding them and reinventing the wheel and spending its scarce resources?
I'm afraid I didn't quite follow that question. We have allocated, or the Prime Minister has allocated the responsibility for the credit union movement to the Ministry of Youth and National Services. We at Finance, we are ready and willing to work with the credit union movement in terms of all of the financial measures that you spoke of. With respect to creating new entities and not dealing with existing entities, I'm not sure exactly what that means. But if you are asking whether we're going to support the credit union movement, the answer is yes. No matter what the issues are in terms of implementation, we are committed to continue to work with the credit union movement because that is a people-centered, people-based movement.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister of Finance. I'd like to wrap it up here now. Thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister.
What you could do is ask for brief closing remarks from everyone.
Okay. I'd like to thank the Honorable Prime Minister and other guests, and I'm going to invite them here now to give some closing remarks before we end today's proceedings and move on to the lunch portion of the segment. Dr. Noel?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Thanks. Thanks. Well, my closing remarks. First of all, let me take this opportunity to wish you all, good afternoon. Thanks for staying with us. From the central bank perspective, on the local economy, we recognize that there are still challenges. We are seeing some green shoot of recovery. The current global economic conditions will dim the prospect slightly. We're still open for the best with respect to, but we are still focusing heavily and mindful that our monetary policy positions need to be appropriately calibrated for any unforeseen downside risk that is likely to pose to the global economy. We will continue to be vigilant in these challenging times, and where necessary, as we have acted in May 2020 in bringing some relief to the financial system, we will continue, as I mentioned, to be vigilant and take necessary steps to ensure the maintenance of financial stability in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the stability of our internal and external prices to support growth.
Honorable Minister of Finance. Oh, sorry. Dr. Seraton, go ahead.
Good Chair. I just want to thank the Minister of Finance for actually hosting this event. I think a lot of the problems we have in Trinidad in terms of garnering consensus, in terms of how we move forward when we experience challenges, is because people simply don't understand, don't know. There's this thing that economists always speak about, which is cognitive dissonance. People don't understand, and I think more of these types of events might be useful. So during the entire budget process, I would encourage the Minister to see if you could put on more of these types of events where people could actually participate in the ongoing discussion about how we address our economic challenges successfully.
Permanent Secretary Lichi.
Yes, thank you, Minister Manning. I would just say that we at the Ministry of Finance stand ready and willing to work under the leadership of the Minister of Finance to effectively manage the resources available to us in the coming fiscal year and beyond. Thanks.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
I would very briefly say things are looking better, but we have to be very careful going forward because we don't know what the future will bring.
I would just like to thank the team, the Ministry of Finance, for putting together this expose this morning, and I trust that the national community will be a little better informed on the circumstances and the resource base that we are dealing with, and to have got the impression that things are a little better now than they were before, and considerably better than when we last met looking into a period of great uncertainty. I also want to say that we are making sacrifices every day. And what one wants to know is that when you make a sacrifice, that you get some benefit from it and not squander it by trying to be either capricious or irresponsible. We do have limitations. There is a finite amount of resources available, and the government commits to ensure that whatever fiscal space we have, that we use it to try and grow the economy while providing comfort and aid to those who are least able to look after themselves. And to do that, we need to rely, without apologizing, for our role in the international marketplace, which at this time has some favorable outturns for us. We don't know how long that will last, but we have to be careful to make the best use of what is coming to us now from the international environment. Because we are such a part of the international economy, prices may change upon us suddenly because of decisions made away from us. So as we try to be upbeat on what's coming to us in the additional revenue, we also have to keep our focus on the source of that and how tenuous that might be. So I simply ask for positivity, restraint, confidence, and trust in God and all the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you all for participating. Let's go forward with confidence and boundless faith in our destiny. Thank you very much.
TheBestToys.com. Shop for the best brands you love at the best prices. Like VTech, Leapfrog, Fisher Price,